It's a pleasure to welcome you today, those of you here in person and those of you online. And while we don't have every seat in this room filled, we have been told that about 1,000 individuals registered for this meeting, a lot online and some present. So we think it's a discussion that has attracted some attention, because we're here today to reflect on the challenge of plastic pollution ahead of the second session of the Intergovernmental Negotiating Committee, the INC2, which is taking place here in Paris. And I think I forgot to introduce myself. I'm the Deputy Secretary General here, Carrie Ann Jones, and this element of the environment falls under my portfolio. So that's why I'm here to open this meeting up, in case you were just wondering. But the big news is that the second negotiation will be happening next week. It's very important. You know, in March 2022, the UN Environment Assembly reached a historic resolution to develop an internationally legally binding instrument on plastic pollution, effectively launching the international community on a mission to end plastic pollution across the globe. We all realize that doing so will be no easy task. The magnitude and the escalating severity of plastics pollution should not be underestimated. The OECD found that global plastics use reached a staggering 460 million metric tons in 2019, generating 353 million metric tons of plastic waste. To put this in context, the amount of plastic waste that we generate each year is equivalent to 35,000 Eiffel Towers. This morning, there was an article in the New York Times that did this in terms of the weight of the Empire State Building, but we'll use the Paris reference. These figures are projected to nearly triple by 2060 under current policies. 22 million tons of plastic waste that we generate each year leak to the environment. The projections for aquatic environments are particularly distressing, with a more than threefold increase in accumulated stocks of plastic between now and 2060. This has serious consequences on aquatic life and ecosystems, including through the bioaccumulation of microplastics in marine organisms, such as the fish we eat, as well as the introduction of alien species and microbial communities, disrupting the balance of often fragile marine or freshwater environments. Plastic pollution cannot be seen in isolation from other environmental challenges. It is a key driver of the triple planetary crisis we currently face: the convergence of accelerating climate change, biodiversity loss, and pollution and waste. The life cycle of plastics significantly contributes to greenhouse gas emissions and sustains our dependence on fossil fuels. Today, plastics generate 1.8 gigatons of CO2, a figure projected to more than double by 2060, accounting for 4.5% of global emissions of greenhouse gases. The historic resolution adopted by the UN Environment Assembly in March 2022 is, however, a real ray of hope when it comes to solving the plastics pollution crisis. It signifies an exceptional level of ambition and determination, and it will require concerted and coordinated efforts to be undertaken by all countries. The OECD stands ready to support these collective efforts. The OECD Global Plastics Outlook already supports decision makers in understanding the scale of the challenges posed by plastics and assessing which policies can promote a more sustainable and circular management of plastic materials. It underlines the need for a life cycle approach to the plastic problem, requiring policy interventions both downstream of the value chain, such as end-of-life management, and upstream, like product design, for an effective policy mix. In driving toward action, we are now leveraging our model in defining a set of policies to enable the elimination of plastic pollution by 2040, an objective set out by a number of parties to the INC. Given more than half of the global top 50 plastic emitting rivers are located in Southeast Asian countries, our future work will also include a focus on ASEAN countries to better understand the specific set of challenges this region faces. All of this builds on our work in recent years on policies aimed at improving markets for recycled plastics, curbing single-use plastics waste, mitigating microplastics pollution, estimating the costs of ending plastic leakage, and promoting sustainable design of plastics from a chemicals perspective. Furthermore, our work on extended producer responsibility remains a significant point of reference for our members' efforts to address plastic waste. Given the important role of trade in plastic supply chains, our work also focuses on informing member countries of the interlinkages between trade and plastic pollution. Finally, the Sustainable Ocean for All initiative supports countries in leveraging ocean and coastal resources sustainably to strengthen their resilient development. As I already mentioned, today's event is taking place shortly before the second session of the Intergovernmental Negotiating Committee next week. This is no coincidence, as the aim of today's discussion is to advance our understanding on three key areas related to the fight against plastic pollution, namely the costs and financing to eliminate plastic pollution, the issue of chemicals in plastics, and finally, the role of trade. In particular, we will be identifying the macroeconomic consequences of ending plastic pollution and considering effective means to mobilize sufficient financial resources from both public and private sectors to support action to end plastic pollution. Familiarizing participants with the challenges of managing chemicals in plastics and discussing possible approaches to address them, and also advancing participants' understanding of the scope and impact of plastic pollution in cross-border value chains and the challenges and opportunities to align trade policies with the objectives of the upcoming treaty. I want to thank you all for being here today, and I wish you a fruitful discussion, paving the way for a very effective round of negotiations next week. So with these comments, I would now like to officially open this discussion and hand the floor over to the moderator for the first session. I'd like to introduce Liz Nichols, who is from the Department of State, the Bureaus of Oceans, Environment, and Science, where she covers circular economy and environmental finance. And the reason why we're both sort of smiling is I used to work in that bureau myself. Liz.
Thank you very much, Carrie Ann. As I was saying earlier, if you had not left, she would be my boss today. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks so much for coming. I'm Liz Nichols. I'm from the U.S. Department of State, and I'm the lead finance negotiator for the United States in the INC process. Thanks for joining, and many thanks to the OECD for hosting this fantastic side event. This is kicking off what we know is going to be a very full week. One housekeeping before we get going, there are some seats in this middle row for those who are on the back bench. If you wanted to, you could come forward. All right, so I think one thing that we all probably can agree on is that mobilizing sufficient resources will be a key facilitator in ending plastic pollution. And we all know that we can't do this with development assistance alone. But thinking through how to engage the private sector effectively, both during the INC process and beyond in the actual implementation of the eventual instrument, that's a significant challenge. And I think it's a unique window of opportunity to get it right from the beginning this time. So our panel today will focus on exactly these aspects of the plastic pollution problem. The session's called Mobilizing Resources to End Plastic Pollution, the Costs and Financing. We have an hour and 20 minutes. We'll structure the session as follows. We'll first hear from the OECD on outputs from their work on the costs and financing to end plastic pollution. Then we'll move to a moderated panel discussion where we will hear insights from our 6 panelists around me from the World Bank, Ghana, Malaysia, the European Commission, the Circulate Initiative, and ProCredit Holding. And then we'll open the floor to your comments and questions. So to set the scene, first, I'd like to introduce Shardul Agrawala, head of the Environment and Economy Integration Division in the OECD Environment Directorate, and Jens Sedmund, Senior Policy Analyst, OECD Development Cooperation Directorate. And I've got 3 questions that I'd like to pose to the 2 of you to kick off with. And the first one's a complex question. And it's, what are the macroeconomic costs of ending plastic pollution? What are the associated investment costs? And how are those distributed in space and across the plastic life cycle? Thanks.
Thanks very much, Madam Chair, and good afternoon to you all from Paris. we'd be happy to answer the 3 questions you pose. In addition, we'll also cover what is the role of development cooperation. As you mentioned, it's part of the solution, although it's not all of the solution. So a lot of what we would present is coming out of this report. Those of you in the room can find it at the back of the room, which is Costs and Financing a Future Free from Plastic Leakage. It is a spin-off analysis from the 2 volumes of the Global Plastics Outlook that we launched last year. So I'm going to talk about the scope of the challenge in terms of eliminating leakage and get into the costs. And Jens, who is from the Development Cooperation Directorate, would then talk about the role of development cooperation in this context. So just starting from something probably all of you know is the rapid increase in global plastics use around the world. It has increased by a factor of 230 from the early 1950s. It stands at 460 million tons, as Deputy Secretary General Jones said, and it's doubled over just the past 2 decades. In fact, the pace of growth of plastics use is 40% quicker than GDP over the same period. We see small dips in this trend, first as a result of the global financial crisis, and more recently as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. But as you can see in both cases, the growth picked up again very shortly after. So that's at the front end of the pipe. But one of the things we did as part of the Global Plastics Outlook, could somebody advance my slide? Sorry about that. It's it came for a second. Yes, that's the one I want. So we mapped the flows of plastic through the economy from the production stage into the economy and then waste and end of life. So I mentioned 460 million tons of plastics produced. They stay for variable amounts of time in the economy. We have an accumulated stock of plastics in the economy of over 3 billion tons. And in 2019, we produced 353 million tons of waste, which ended up either through formal waste management processes, so half of it was landfilled. We have 45 million tons, which was incinerated, roughly the same amount collected for recycling. But what I want you to focus on is mismanaged waste. So over 80 million tons was mismanaged and littered. And that ended up in the environment in various ways, in our rivers and oceans, but also burnt in open pits on land, or left in dump sites, and so on. And this is the core of the environmental leakage challenge. Now, in terms of where the biggest challenge of mismanaged waste is, to a large extent, it's in non-OECD countries now. It's over 80% of the waste mismanagement is in non-OECD countries. And these are the trends over the last 2 decades. So if we look into the future, what we are projecting is a tripling of plastics production by 2060. So we had 460 million tons in 2019, 1.2 billion tons by 2060. The rates of growth are different around the world. For most of the advanced countries, there's going to be a doubling of plastics production. And in many regions, other regions of the world, there's going to be much higher growth rates. So for sub-Saharan Africa, it might be as high as 6 times, India 5.5 times, and so on. And on waste, we also project a tripling of waste. Now, there's a good news and a bad news story because recycling rates, even under business as usual, would nearly double. But the sheer tonnage of mismanaged waste is also projected to double, even though the share of mismanaged waste is going to decline. And that's the core of the challenge we need to address when we are talking about resource and financing needs. Now, we estimated what would be the investment needs to stop these leakage pathways. And the investment needs are in waste collection, but also in boosting recycling infrastructure. And we estimate that between now and 2060, we need roughly $600 billion of investment. And you can see the breakdown between OECD and non-OECD countries. So for boosting recycling infrastructure, the costs are fairly significant in both advanced and developing countries. But in developing countries, there's an additional need to invest in closing leakage pathways as well. So the basic waste collection and waste treatment infrastructure. So those are the numbers that we have in terms of investment needs. These are cumulative numbers. And if you look at annualized needs, it's roughly $10 billion per year in non-OECD countries. Now, when we talk about macroeconomic costs, the overall costs to the economy to stop plastic leakage, and in this case, we were working on the 2060 timeframe. Now the discussions now are focused on 2040, and the ambition needs to be a lot higher. But this is the breakdown of macroeconomic costs in different regions of the world to virtually eliminate macroplastic leakage by 2060. The global average is around 0.8% of GDP, but you can see for many of the emerging and developing economies, which are on the right end of the spectrum, the costs are significantly higher. They can go up to 3% of GDP. Now, so the scale of action that's required by developing countries and the unequal distribution of projected costs call for better international support and resource mobilization. It's going to come from multiple sources, both public and private. One of the pieces of the puzzle is development cooperation. And my colleague Jens Sedman would now introduce what role development cooperation can play.
Thank you very much, Shardul. And I think the first thing to say is that the role of development cooperation was recognized in key international fora. It was referenced in the G20, G7, but also major beneficiaries of development cooperation, such as ASEAN member states, have identified the relevance of mobilizing resources and development finance resources, in particular to tackle ocean plastics pollution. And in the International Negotiating Committee, the INC1 summary also mentioned the importance of financing and basically made it a key discussion topic within ongoing negotiations. And for INC2, the submissions by member states and stakeholders also emphasize very much the importance of ensuring adequate support. So I think it's very clearly recognized in the discussions that are going to be taking place next week and that have started before. Now, what we've tried to do, I think, is basically quantify development cooperation or development finance support to the issue. To do that, we examined activity level data. We have our OECD database on development finance that basically has very granular activity level information to identify projects targeting waste management in general and also plastics pollution in particular. And that enabled us to estimate the volumes of finance aimed at curbing plastics pollution and also improving waste management. And basically what we see is that development finance flows have been on an increasing trend and pretty consistent growth since 2015. At the same time, they only represent a fraction, only about 1% of total development finance, which I think also maybe sounds very little, but it has to be put into perspective in all the development needs that development finance serves. Now, the biggest share of this finance has been concessional and concessional development finance, which accounted for 54% of total development finance from 2014 to 2019. And then sort of the regular financing through basically standard MDB lending windows to in particular upper middle income countries, which accounted for the other share and which has increased very strongly for the 2020 data point that we see on the right side of this graph. Now, another point is to look at the different instruments basically and also different focus areas that we have. So most funding or most support basically comes in the form of debt instrument. And basically the explanation behind that is that it's infrastructure heavy finance. Basically anything that is related to infrastructure asset financing very rarely takes the form of grants and is delivered typically in loans. And debt instruments represented 55% of the total development finance for the sector in the period from 2014 to 2020. Followed then by grants and other instruments which are related to mobilization of private finance and can take the form of things like collective investment vehicles, financing and guarantee schemes and the like. Now, the increase was mostly driven by the concessional finance, so grants and highly concessional debt. Sorry, go on. Now, what's also interesting to see is a bit of a distribution issue. If we look in terms of regional distribution and actually look at the sources of finance and or basically the sources of leakage of waste and look in comparison to basically where development finance goes. And what we see is that development finance to curb plastic pollution is not necessarily a perfect reflection of where most of the leakage takes place. So for instance, if we take 2019 here and we take the example of India, which as a very big country contributed 11% of plastic leakage among developing countries, it only received about 1% of development finance to curb ocean plastics pollution as an average for the 2018 to 2020 period. Now, contrary to that, if you look at ODA eligible European countries, so European countries that have developing country status, they only contribute about 2% to total plastic leakage, but received 90% of development finance. Now, to say this is a very initial and in somewhat crude analysis, so I think further analysis would be required, and it can relate to many things, absorptive capacities, the policies that are in place basically to make these kinds of investments work. But it's certainly always an interesting aspect to follow further. And then what we see also is that there's a relatively high concentration in terms of the providers of finance for plastics, or rather, plastic pollution. The overall, actually, what we see in that there's an increasing focus across the number of providers over the period that we looked at. And it was about 37 when we look at the data for 2015 to 2017. So 37 donor development finance institutions that were active in this area, which increased to 52 in the 2018 to 2020 space. But the top 10 providers that you can see here, they still provide about 80% of total funding. And they're notably the EU institutions, the Asian Development Bank, the IDA, the International Development Association of the World Bank, as the top 3 providers, followed by, excuse me, a number of bilateral and other multilateral institutions. Again, this is not necessarily a concentration that is very unusual, because in many areas you have high concentration areas of major actors, but it's still interesting to observe. Now, as a final point, what we see is that with the increasing focus on the issue of plastics pollution, there's also emergence that development cooperation, development finance providers are testing new ways to address plastic pollution. And that's both in terms of increasing volumes of resources available, but also with a view to enhancing their impact. And we identified 8 main ways that sort of look at new opportunities to address plastic pollution in development cooperation. Basically, they can be divided into policy and finance approaches. Excuse me. On the policy side, we have 3 things that we see. The first is supporting adoption of plastic-related policy instruments, where this basically is possible within the local conditions. The second is fostering the creation and adoption of plastics-related innovation, both in terms of focusing on technology transfer and also local development of innovation. And the third point is adopting a gender-sensitive approach in waste management projects, which is basically recognized or excuse me, which recognize the key role women play in solving the plastics issue. Now, on the financing side, there's also some innovation, and please give me a second. Excuse me. So here we have identified 5 ways that that donors are looking at basically to focus more and generate more resources and impact. First is basically aligning future development finance flows with the circularity principles, in particular those related to the UNEP-FI criteria. The second point that is very popular, not just in this area, is looking more at blended finance approaches and using those to tackle plastics pollutions. Again, linked closely is a question of scaling up green or blue bonds for plastics. Another point is results-based financing for plastics management, waste management. So basically linking the payout of specific financial instruments to a demonstrated impact or effect of individual activities. And the third one is developing financing instruments that lever synergies across different sectors. For instance, the introduction of tourism taxes to finance cleanup, which particularly I think you can see in some small island developing states that have high shares of tourism in their economies. Now, to conclude, basically effective development cooperation requires 4 points to be reflected further and to consider it further. One is the basic line that to do more at some point you'll need to have more resources. So, you know, a stronger focus will be important. But I think the other point is that right next and connected to this is enhancing the global targeting of resources in a way that aligns with countries' needs and priorities. And that comes back to the very basic principle of ownership that you need to have effective action. Third is basically linking this very closely to and adopting international good practices and fostering innovation through development cooperation. And the fourth and fairly basic, but still very important point is really promoting mutual learning and developing guidance for effective development cooperation in this area. And this is something that we hope to contribute from our side to the discussion. And with that, thank you very much. And I pass it back to the moderator.
Many thanks, Shardul and Jens, for that really fantastic overview of the macroeconomic costs of tackling this problem, the associated investment costs, and the way that development assistance maps onto this problem, which gives us a lot of insight about ways to scale up future action. So following that, next, we will turn to some initial interventions from our 6 panelists. We're going to take them roughly in order of development assistance, member states, and then the private sector. We're going to ask everyone to give us 4 minutes of the most important things you want to say to this audience about how public and private finance can come together in plastic pollution mitigation. And first, we have Anjali Acharya, Marine Plastics Lead and Senior Environmental Specialist at the World Bank.
Thank you. You've shaved off 1 minute from our time. Thank you so much, and really appreciate the opportunity to present here today. I think everyone in this room is excited to be here. We have the motivation to work on towards this plastics treaty. We have the momentum starting from the UNEA resolution. We have the measures. We know what many of those measures are. So where's the money? That's basically what we're talking about today. What are the different sources of finance? How can countries access it? Where would it come from? What are the different asset classes, etc.? So what do we know about public sources of financing? We have several documents that have gone out. And by the way, I've really appreciated your presentation on the macroeconomic costs. Public source of financing, we know what they are, right? You have plastic fees, taxes, levies. Should you put a ban on plastic bags? Could you put tax on plastic bags? How useful is it? What kinds of different instruments can you have? Everybody's talking about extended producer responsibility, where you require plastic producers and importers to take responsibility for their products. Will that be mandatory? Will that be voluntary? Many countries here and at the negotiations will be talking through these aspects. Public-private partnerships. One of the important things is how do we bring together public financing and private financing? And the public sector has an important role to play here in unlocking private finance. What kinds of policies can they put in place to improve the enabling environment to attract private sector in terms of financing, innovation, technology, etc. Product charges. We have different kinds of product charges, and the colleague from Ghana will be talking, I think, about different kinds of plastic taxes. Are there single-use product charges that can be put in place? And there are other kinds of market-based approaches. From our side, while these are many of the domestic sources of finance, what about the allocation of international public finance? And you talked a little bit about that. I was really excited to see your graphs, even if it's at the higher level. In terms of organizations like the World Bank, who invest approximately 120 billion annually in international public finance, it becomes important to consider how to get the funds to the right people at the right time for the right measures in the right places and for the right reasons. So what are we doing? We're investing in the following. We're investing in data on marine plastic resources. We all know if you can't measure it, you can't monitor it. If you can't monitor it, you can't manage it. And if you can't manage it, you don't know what to do with implementation. So it's really important to understand what are the marine plastic sources, the pathways, the different kinds of impacts. We're also investing in transitions to circular economy, really looking at recycled plastic markets, etc. But a lot of emphasis also upstream on reuse. How do we design not just for recycling, but design for reuse? Importantly, we're investing in game changer tools. We have last year put out the plastic policy simulator and the plastic substitution trade-off estimator, which are really data-driven tools for policy analysis to help countries decide which policy instrument is ideal for their particular plastics context, for their particular capacity context, for their particular socioeconomic context. We're also investing in national plastic action plans, roadmaps to phase out single-use plastic. I see some colleagues here who are representing countries that we support, and circular economy strategies. And we're not just working at the individual national level, we're working at the regional level and global level. Colleagues before Shardul had mentioned about the focus on ASEAN. We have large programs in the ASEAN, in South Asia, and soon in West Africa to bring together regional harmonization of policies, and that in turn will feed into the global plastic treaties. Now, the options paper for UNEP that UNEP put out talked about the financing mechanisms, and this is also important to talk about. What would be the financing mechanism? And it puts together options such as, should we have a standalone new financing mechanism? Should we work with an existing financing mechanism? Should we have some kind of a hybrid mechanism? And we would argue that it's important to avoid a fragmentation of financing, such as what we have seen in the climate finance space. Use existing mechanisms. There is a tremendous momentum, 2 short years, and we have to put together this treaty. Let's keep that momentum. We're on an accelerated path. We have to make sure that the financing is leveraged, coordinated, and supporting countries around the world. For example, from the World Bank, we have the Pro-Blue Multi-Donor Fund, which has many donors, many of whom are here today, that have put together money. We have a portfolio right now of about $40 million invested in 60 countries. And we're supporting many of these critical things in terms of analytical work, in terms of policy work, and in terms of identifying investment. And finally, what about access to finance and efficient resource delivery? We have to try to work together, and I'm proud to be on the panel with several of you all here today, to simplify the bureaucratic processes and paperwork requirements. We don't want countries to say, oh, this is the World Bank policies and regulations, we have these other policies and regulations. We need to find a way to simplify, to build on existing successful approaches, minimizing intermediaries, and ensure that the funds reach the affected people, the effective countries promptly. The World Bank Group, from our side, we are committed to bringing our global expertise, our convening power, and our financing, but I'm amongst friends here. So I think it's important to say that we will work in partnership. We have a common goal. We need to reduce our consumption and use of plastics. We remember a time when plastics was not so common. And as was said in the City of Paris meeting earlier this morning, we need to break our addiction to plastic. Thank you.
Anjali, thank you so much. Next, we hear from Oliver Bawachi, Special Advisor to the Minister in the Ministry of Environment, Science, Technology, and Innovation in Ghana.
Thank you very much, Liz. I always want to start by reminding myself and also those who are with us about the goals of the resolution that has started this whole process. UNEA Resolution 514 calls for an end to plastics pollution. That is the goal, including in the marine environment, through an international legally binding instrument. The resolution also calls for a full life cycle approach based on the principles of circular economy. And the resolution enjoins all member states to be ambitious and to be innovative in our approaches. Now, what Ghana is advocating is that in addition to ending the plastic pollution, a treaty must also lead to a total transformation of the plastics industry. And the treaty must serve as a strong catalyst for a just transition to circular economy. So these are the pillars or the basis of the proposal that we have submitted for it to be embedded in the treaty that we are negotiating. The proposal is called the Global Plastic Pollution Fee, or GPPF. And it makes three very key contributions towards the treaty's objectives. The first one is that it will reduce the production and consumption of plastics. Through the eco-modulation schemes that are embedded in this fee structure, GPPF will also encourage producers to switch to more sustainable alternatives that are based on circularity. And GPPF can raise very significant revenues to fund the treaty's implementation, including paying for a global end-of-life infrastructure to close the pollution gap and also address the problem of what we call legacy plastics. This proposal rests on 6 key pillars, but for the purpose of our discussions today, and because of limited time, I'll probably address just 4 of these pillars. The first is what we call the plastic pollution gap. The plastic pollution gap is the difference between the volume of plastic waste that we generate globally and the global capacity to manage that waste in an environmentally safe and sound way. Now, to achieve the treaty's ambitious objectives, we need to close that plastic pollution gap. As long as the pollution gap exists, the volume of plastic pollution will continue to grow every day. And that means that the objective of the treaty, which is to end plastic pollution, will never be achieved. That's number 1. Even with ambitious upstream and midstream control measures to limit production and promote circularity, the pollution gap is expected to keep growing in decades to come. And to close this pollution gap and implement the objectives of ending plastic pollution, we must take significant investments, make significant investments in environmentally sound and safe waste management infrastructure, especially in Africa and other developing countries. And we must also eliminate legacy plastic pollution, which is a very important source of ongoing pollution. The previous speakers have cited the case of 2019. In 2019, the world produced about 460 million tons of plastics. 353 million tons of waste was generated, as was cited by the previous speaker. 78 to 80 million tons was left as mismanaged plastics, and that was added to the existing legacy pollution. If we are going to end plastic pollution, that gap must be closed. So how do we close that gap? We have to reduce production and we have to reduce consumption. We have to design and produce plastics that are based on circularity so that we can recycle them at the end of its life. We must be able to collect and recycle waste plastics so that nothing leaks into the environment. And when recycling is not possible, we must dispose in an environmentally safe and sound way. So what do we need to be able to do this? There must be global coordinated effort based on policies and fiscal measures, as has been addressed by the previous speakers. It requires considerable funding, and it requires global waste management infrastructure. It also requires technology and innovation. So that is the first pillar. The second pillar has to do with what we all know as the polluter pays principle. The polluter pays principle is applied to hold producers whose products pollute the environment to account. Under the principle, producers are asked to contribute financially towards the management of the waste and the pollution that results from the use of their products. GPPF calls for the extension of the polluter pays principle to cover those producers of plastic polymers whose entire production creates environmental risks and cost wherever it ends up. Currently, only those producers who use already produced plastics to package their products, that's those who exist in the mainstream section of the life cycle, are the ones who are held to account when they are asked to contribute to national EPR schemes. GPPF calls for the extension of the polluter pays principle to cover those producers of plastic polymers, as well as the producers of plastics within the upstream segment of the life cycle. Based on the polluter pays principle, GPPF will substantially increase the financial resources that are made available to implement this global treaty. So that's the second pillar. The third one is the establishment of the fund based on the levies that we are going to collect from these producers. We want to establish a fund whose focus is on plastics so that we make available to every country the capacity to manage their waste. If there's any country in the world who is not capable of managing its waste, this whole idea of ending plastic pollution will never end, because the weakest link is the weakness in the chain. If even one country is left out, we are at a total risk, and therefore the fund must be able to provide infrastructure for every country, whether it's in a developed economy or in a developing economy to be able to manage their waste. The fees must be based on the production volumes and also based on eco-modulation schemes. And as I said before, the target is to ensure that all countries can collect, transport, sort, and recycle, and those that we are not able to recycle, to be able to find environmentally sound ways of managing them. And finally, this fee, when collected, must be aligned with what we call the national action plans of each country. Those areas, for example, if there's a country's EPR scheme that has weaknesses, this fee or this fund must be able to support them to strengthen their existing EPR schemes so that they can do the work they are doing better. And it must also enable all countries to manage their legacy plastic pollution. It can support technical assistance and capacity building, and can also support technology transfer. We believe that if we are able to implement this fee effectively, there are some other impacts that we have not even talked about. There will be significant growth in global economy if countries or if developed countries and emerging economies are able to produce and supply and maintain all the waste management systems that are required in all these countries that we are talking about. We believe that is going to spur economic growth in those areas. It will lead to substantial growth in business in developing and emerging economies, and it will create a lot of jobs in developing countries, especially in the vulnerable segments of those economies. It will also serve as a very strong catalyst for transition to circular economy, because if countries are able to manage their waste effectively, that is what the transition to circular economy is all about. And we believe that it will lead or result in a revolutionary transformation of the plastics industry. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Oliver. And now we're going to hear from Eddie Mazaunsha, Deputy Undersecretary, Ministry of Natural Resources, Environment and Climate Change, Malaysia.
Sorry. Thank you, Liz. At this juncture, I don't want to go into the details of what Malaysia has been doing yet, but just to echo or building up from Anjali's point or Anjali's question when she raised the question of where is the money? Well, from the perspective of Malaysia, a developing nation, I can say that the money is everywhere, but it's not where we want it. Well, to put it simply, we can see the breakdowns or the matrix of financing being offered in our journey to address plastic pollution. It is well, heavy top and where the policy development will have more financing assistance. But when it comes to the actual on-the-ground waste management facilities or waste management infrastructure, the financing is getting smaller and smaller. And going back to the needs coming from developing nation, and as well as presented by Shardul, that we require at least $600 billion to finance waste management and recycling by 2060. And most of the mismanaged plastic, as presented, 80% of it are generating from non-OECD, and that includes developing nation like Malaysia. Now, if Malaysia were to address the current priorities, we need to invest fully on waste management infrastructure or facilities. But we don't see financing coming for that particular priorities. Secondly, we fully agree that in mobilizing those circular economy action is not a one-man show. Public finance has been coming. For example, in Malaysia, we have issued 3 bonds since 2017, 3 green or blue, whatever color we want to call it, since 2017 and up to last year. And we only see 4.1% of the investment coming from international investment. Again, the private investment is not up to the par when we were to compare with public financing. And we would like to urge, and especially during the negotiation, for private financing to be mainstream, so that collectively we are, showing impact in addressing marine plastic pollution or plastic pollution. Thirdly, if we were to go back to the INC processes or the soon-to-be plastic treaty, we need also to provide financing for incremental costs. And going back to the context of developing nation, we see if we were to comply with the global commons, or we were to comply with the global targets and so on and so forth, there'll be incremental costs. And to only hope for public financing to finance the incremental cost, it's too burdensome. And we urge for the treaty to also provide a mechanism so that developing nation can finance all the incremental costs in mobilizing or implementing the agreement. And when we talk about achieving the global commons, and I do agree with our colleagues from Ghana when we say that we need to stop producing unnecessary plastic, problematic plastic, and so on and so forth. But again, without finding safer alternative or substitute to those deemed problematic and unnecessary plastic, we are going to disrupt the market even worse. And financing for substitutes or alternative must be made available, so that the ambition of us putting a stop to plastic pollution can be complemented with a just transition by having a sustainable, safer, and viable substitute. And that will not hamper the economic potential of plastic in the first place. And that will also facilitate the industry to produce better plastic. And I think those kind of component of financing needs to be deliberated through the process of INC, so that the treaty would provide a way forward for all countries to adopt circular economy for plastic. And I think I stopped at that list. Maybe we can go on with what Malaysia has been doing so far in the next segment. Thank you, Liz.
Eddie, thank you so much. Now we'll hear from Ugo Schally, Advisor for International Negotiations in the Directorate General for the Environment at the European Commission.
Thank you, Liz. It's a pleasure to be here this afternoon. Before we start the next round of discussions that will shape our way towards a global agreement on plastic pollution. When we discuss this treaty, I'm always remembering an image that was used in one of the discussions I was part of. I was saying, well, if your bathtub is overflowing, you don't start with mopping the floor, you actually start with closing the tap. I think that that is interesting in the context of our discussion today, and I think it's emblematic that where our discussion has moved. the whole discussion around plastic pollution started from the concern about marine plastic pollution, then went on into the consideration of plastic pollution in all environments. And then, of course, looking into what is the integrality of the plastics life cycle and its impact on the environment and plastic pollution as such. And I think it's also very clear, and that was very helpful in the presentations by the colleagues from OECD, that we probably haven't yet reached the necessary level of full understanding of what are the macroeconomic costs and opportunities in the future implementation of a treaty. Because what we've seen so far is a very large focus on the cost with regard of implementing waste management infrastructure based on the structure of the plastics economy as we see it now. Now, I think we need to put that in the context of what we're trying to achieve through the negotiation of a treaty, which is actually having, as the options paper that has been produced by the Secretariat, looking at trying to get to a situation where the volume of production of primary plastic becomes sustainable, linked to the elimination of chemicals and materials and additives that make plastics difficult to recycle and dispose of, linked to the elimination and banning of products that by their nature are prone to be leaked into the environment, therefore have a bigger propensity of being leaked or make it more difficult to deal with. And of course, the issue of the uptake of recycled plastic as secondary raw material, which means that I would argue we need to look at it in its totality. And I would agree with the two speakers between which I'm sandwiched here, that it is clearly a case of application of the polluter pays principle, and that the approach to financing needs to reflect the volume and level of production that we see worldwide in that regard. Having said that, I think we need to look in terms of where would the investment that could be made have the most impact? Where would it be most effective? How can we actually make sure that the stream of material that reaches potential waste management infrastructure is actually adapted to the needs and the requirements of the country concerned? How can we maximize the investment and not, as a matter of fact, establish waste management infrastructure that in a way is, and I'm sorry to be very blunt here, which is a subsidy to unsustainable consumption and production. So I think that's a challenge in that regard. I think that we need to run through that in a very hard analysis. And I think listening to the discussion so far, I think some of that analysis hasn't been made yet in that regard. I think there's a very, very detailed analysis on a status quo assessment of what we would need in waste infrastructure if we continue to do what we do, but we're actually trying to change that. So I think we actually need also to look into the necessary changes and the transformation of industry. And that is where it becomes important to understand what would be the incentives and what would be the tools and levers to actually bring the private investment in alignment with the objectives and the obligations of the future treaty. So I think it's very difficult at this point in time to actually look at the mechanism that we would use. I think we should rather focus on identifying the different funding streams that we might need, the focus of action that we might want to adapt, also recognizing the reality of international funding that doesn't come through single conduits, but continues to come through a variety of conduits, bilateral, multilateral, the World Bank, multilateral development banks, regional, so that we actually would need, if we have to discuss a funding mechanism, to focus very much on what would be the added value of any mechanism, what additional resources would that mechanism generate, and how and in what complementarity would it act in the context of the overall funding landscape. I think those are issues that I think we will benefit from using the time next week to have a very thorough discussion and go through. I think it's very helpful to go away from the usual interaction that we have in the context of financing decisions in international negotiation by focusing on an integrated approach, looking at the whole landscape from international and domestic, public and private, to see where all those funding could come from. But then, of course, not to start from saying, well, what is the mechanism that we want to use? What is the amount that we need? But rather saying, what is it that, to go back to Eddie's image, to say, where is the money and where should it go to? And I think that should actually then lean back to a discussion on the mobilization question. I'll stop here and I hope I saved a little bit of time.
Thank you for all being willing subjects to my minute cut. Thank you so much, Ugo. That was really interesting. We'd like to move now to the opposite end of the table, and we'll hear from Krasimira Piakaiva, head of the group Environmental Impact Reporting at ProCredit Holding and a member of the UNEP Finance Initiative-led Finance Leadership Group on Plastics.
Thank you, Liz. Sorry to take your microphone a bit earlier, and thanks to all the participants for the great contributions until now. I think they're very insightful. Indeed, I'm glad to represent here the Finance Leadership Group on Plastic, and also to share ProCredit experience in developing and implementing our plastic strategy. Let me first share a few words on the Finance Leadership Group on Plastic. We are a core group of banks and insurers with total assets of close to 10 trillion euro, convened by the UNEP-FI and sponsored by Minderu Foundation. As we are convinced in the fact that the private finance sector has to play a key role in tackling the plastic pollution, we are willing and ready to contribute to the development of the international legally binding instrument. We have conducted a number of discussions, and as a first outcomes of this, we have just recently issued our response paper with 10 key messages that we want to be considered as objectives in the future plastic treaty, among which I would like to highlight, apart from recognizing the key role of the private finance in this, is very important to set clear, measurable and time-bound overarching objectives of the treaty. Include the objective to align financial flows from all sources, public and private, with the objective of ending plastic pollution, and also to create a mandatory framework and environment that will enable the redirection of the financial flows. So increasing those and investing more in solutions to end plastic pollutions and stimulate safe and just circular plastic economy, and decrease flows which contribute to plastic pollution. I could later on, if we have time, provide further details on the recommendations of the Finance Leadership Group. But when talking about investing and disinvesting in certain activities, I want to relate to the experience of ProCredit specifically related to dealing plastic issue. ProCredit is impact-oriented banking group, which is operating mostly in countries of Eastern and Southeastern Europe and also Ecuador. The focus is supporting local SME companies in these countries which as a common have multiple economic, social, political issues, and where, in spite of their acute impact, environmental topics are not yet given sufficient attention. In spite of this, ProCredit has addressed and incorporated environmental and social assessment in its lending operations since its foundation, and since more than 10 years also invested in developing green finance and climate finance, very often also in cooperation with multilateral development institutions, some of which being also our shareholders. In doing this, we have also established in each of the institutions a lot of expertise and competence in these topics, going down to the business and credit risk staff. And as part of the efforts to address environmental topics, of course, we were also alarmed by the scale which the plastic pollution is reaching. And in 2019, in spite of the fact that there were not coordinating efforts, especially in the finance sector, but also on the regulatory framework and on the country level to address the topic, we developed our strategy to reduce the production and usage of plastic. It basically relates to companies engaged in all stages of the plastic production, and looks at the type of plastic or the type of plastic products that they are engaged in. And depending on this, we either completely exclude financing of activities, or in the common sense, engage in discussions with the clients, and in order to finance them, require them to commit to transition to more sustainable practices. Basically, these types of activities are, on the first place, part of our official exclusion list. Also, certain single-use plastic items which can be abolished. They are short-term used. Commonly, they are also the ones which the EU directive on single-use plastic is addressing. So there we would not at all proceed with financing companies. The second bigger category is, again, the so-called gray list activities, which also have high environmental impact and usually are with short-term usage, such as packaging, food and other type of packaging, bottles, foils, and so on. So in such cases, we do thorough analysis of each client and their strategy to producing the items, and we would only finance if the clients are already implementing or are willing to commit a transition plan, so to implement different types of strategy to improve the sustainability of these products, be it increasing the recycled input of the material, reducing the plastic content, assuring recyclability of the products, committing to extended producer responsibility, engaging or even initiating very often in local initiatives to tackle plastic pollution, plastic waste, basically engage in increasing the awareness. In spite of many challenges, of course, we also have, and the lack of incentives in most cases, we have already a good track record of really very nice examples of changes that clients undertook based on these engagements from our side. And the rest of plastics is where we still don't have contractual requirements for our clients, is usually the long-term plastic, where alternatives don't exist, or if they exist, they are even with higher environmental impact. Nevertheless, we also try to understand this type of activities and discuss with our clients possibilities to make them in a more sustainable way, or at least to start the thinking in this direction. What is important about our strategies is not just disinvesting or excluding certain activities, is more the engagement with the clients active in these sectors, and trying to convince them and incentivize them to take measures to improve their approaches. And I'm convinced, I mean, in implementing the strategy, we have faced numerous challenges, from really very fragmented regulations, different in the different countries, addressing different stages of the plastic production, lack of knowledge and expertise, especially for the financial sector. We are not material experts, and then the efforts to define what is good plastic, what is bad plastic, what could be a meaningful criteria or covenant for the clients, what share of recycled material, for example, we should aim, and so on. So lack of infrastructure in the country for waste management, but we are certain that the fact that in spite of these challenges, we managed to progress with a big number of our clients. If the plastic treaty addresses these challenges, many of which we also address in the keynote paper of the Finance Leadership Group of Plastics, then the impact and the success of the transition, the role of the private finance sector also in engaging with their clients will be much more substantial. And yeah, if we have time for further discussion, glad then to refer further on this topic and on the different private public partnership experiences that we also had. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Krasimira. And last but absolutely not least, we have Umesh Madhavan, who's the research director from the Circulate Initiative. Over to you, Umesh.
Thank you, Liz. Last but not the least, but definitely a pleasure sitting here and then listening to all the great conversations that we're having. We are a nonprofit organization working on tackling the plastic pollution challenge and building circular economies and equitable economies across emerging markets. So our work is primarily focused on emerging markets. We work to close the financing gap for a plastic circular economy, and I emphasize circular economy and not plastic pollution specifically here. And the idea is that we shed light on the private capital that is flowing into the space, how these transactions happen, and how we overcome barriers to investing. I think that's a common theme that I've heard through all this discussion so far. So building on that, I'd like to share 3 key lessons that we've learned from our work in this space. And I think some of them really not be surprising to you. Some of them might be as well. Firstly, the absolute truth. There is not enough capital which is being invested, private capital which is being invested. And there is a significant financing gap between what is needed and the current financing flows. Secondly, there are gaps between where the investment is required and of that money which is flowing in, where it is being directed. And finally, as I will share through some examples, there is an opportunity both to accelerate the capital flows and to make sure that that amount which is coming through, the investment which is coming through, is distributed along the solution for plastic pollution. Let me start with the overall capital flows, and I'll draw reference to Shardul and Jens' presentation from before. So hidden in one of those slides was actually the amount which is needed specifically for infrastructure and waste management in emerging economies. And in the OECD report, if you look at it closely, you will see a figure of 25 billion euros, which is required annually in emerging economies. So that translates to roughly about 27 billion US dollars. So what we did was we said, okay, we have all of these great numbers, but there's absolutely no transparency in terms of what's the capital flows. So we launched what's called as a plastic circularity investment tracker. I think there should be a QR code which can be shared. And what that showed was that between 2018 and 2022, first 9 months of September, so we'll keep updating the data. You can track the data by accessing this code. Only 850 million of private capital was invested. So over a 4.5-year period, we had $4.5 billion, which we tracked in emerging markets, about 38 countries. And if you sort of annualize that number, you'll get about 850 million. And that's across all kinds of solutions that you have in terms of tackling plastic pollution. So that's the total estimate. So 4.1 billion, which is currently flowing into emerging markets vis-a-vis the 27 billion, which I think Shardul and Jens and the OECD report actually references. Okay, we have 4 billion. Where is that capital actually being invested? So what we noticed was that most of that money is towards downstream solutions, such as recycling and recovery. I think that should be something which should not come as a surprise to most of us, because at least in emerging markets, basic waste management services are chronically underfunded. But it was not just the fact that it is downstream solutions which are receiving the money, but the fact that it was 88% of that 4 billion we tracked, which actually was going into downstream solutions. So the higher investor interest in downstream solutions is because the systems are more mature, economics are more favorable, and profitability is proven. So private investors see recycling and recovery to be of comparatively lower risk. So when you start looking up the value chain, they're hesitant to finance more novel or emerging solutions, whether it be material alternatives, whether it be refill and reuse solutions. One of the topics which is least discussed when you look at capital allocation is the investment in business models where there is significant reliance on informal workers. So most investors again are hesitant where they see that as a risk. But what we need to remember the changing dynamics in relation to regulation. So if you look at CSDD or CSRD, which is expected to come up, and the greater transparency, not just for a single company, which is expected of the whole value chain, we need to make sure that investors do not stay away due to the perceived risk of the informality of the value chain. So if we start thinking of an instrument, what does it include? Firstly, a shift from managing plastic waste to moving up the value chain. More capital needs to be invested in reducing avoidable plastic, reusing the plastic, and also making sure that we have more material alternatives, redesign solutions, refill solutions, reuse solutions funded. One of the other considerations for any financing mechanism should be that it should be inclusive of the 15 to 20 million informal waste workers who are dependent on waste collection. They are in this only because they want to put food on the table, and this is quite critical in emerging markets. Now, I've stated the issues. Let me give you a little bit of a ray of hope in terms of how we can increase the capital flows. One example we'd like to highlight is our collaboration with the World Economic Forum's Global Plastic Action Partnership, where we've illustrated 10 case studies of investments that have spurred the growth of an interest towards circular innovations and business models. So I'll just share one example here. I mean, I had a few listed, but in the interest of time, I'll just stick to one. So a few years ago, the government of India adopted extended producer responsibility. And that was in conjunction with its Swachh Bharat or Clean India initiative. And this policy initiative actually was a game changer, not for waste management companies, but actually for a startup, which is focused on improving transparency through digital solutions that help companies with EPR compliance and tracking material flows. So the company Recycle actually raised its first million in financing in 2019, and an additional 22 million in 2022. They project that with the capital that they have received, the private capital that they have received, they can prevent more than 1.7 million tons of plastic leakage by 2030, while also eliminating 2.4 million tons of CO2 emissions. So to quickly wrap up my submission, as we are all in some way or form part of the INC discussion, and as we start exploring what the financing mechanism should look like, I'd say that the focus should not only be on mobilizing additional private capital, but on a more equitable distribution of that capital for solutions along the whole plastics value chain. And finally, of capital which is inclusive of that marginalized section of the society who are dependent on plastic waste collection. Thank you, Liz, and back to you. Liz?
Thank you so much, Umesh, and thanks to all of our panelists. That was rich and detailed and wonderful. Thank you so much for your insights. I think we probably have time for 2 concise questions from the audience. We would welcome participants here in the room to raise your physical hand and let us know if you'd like to make an intervention. And I think that the World Economic Forum may ask the first question.
Hi, everyone. Thank you. My name is Taylor Clayton. I'm from the Global Plastic Action Partnership at the World Economic Forum. Thanks for these remarks by the panelists today. A question I had was just a reflection on some of the comments from Malaysia, but several others as well, and just in terms of the gap in private finance that we see. And I think it's safe to say that we don't have a lot of representation maybe from the private financial sector in the room. I know there's a few familiar faces. So I'm just curious to have thoughts from the panel on how that gap can be addressed through the treaty process, and how we can ensure that these reflections are brought into the INC negotiations both next week, but also in the INC negotiations to come in the next 18 months. Thank you.
Is there another question in the back?
Yes, hello, Serene Rashid from the Global Alliance for Incinerator Alternatives. Thank you for your interventions. My question is, given today the recognition by Norway's Minister of Environment that the plastic solutions to the plastic pollution crisis are indissociable from our planetary boundaries in the financing solutions, how do we ensure that waste management processes that represent threats for our planetary boundaries, and it could be from the carbon intensity angle, it could be from the toxics angle, are not amplified, and that we unwittingly are transferring one form of pollution to another instead of really tackling this plastic pollution crisis at its source and upstream? Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for those excellent questions. I'm going to open up to our panel to give a very brief response. Who would like to take the first question from the World Economic Forum?
Thank you. I can try to give a response, maybe from the perspective of having been exposed to discussions around blended finance and how to mobilize private finance and investment also in other areas. And I think the bottom line it really comes to is, you need the returns, you need the cash flow, and basically for that you need a market. And I think in a way that for me links to the cost issue, because if you put a cost at the same time, you create a price, and if you create a price, you create an economic value that you can put into a business proposition, an investment and a financing proposition. If there's no cost, there's nothing to be gained, basically. So that's really, I think, the in a way the nice combination of the cost and the opportunity that putting the cost and sort of internalizing it into the process brings. But fundamentally, and I apologize if I stay at a fairly general level, but I think it always comes back to the same questions, whether it's in climate change or in biodiversity or elsewhere. If you want private sector investments, you need to have a business model, and if you have the business model, you can finance that usually. So that's, and again, it's about creating the market, integrating that in the economy that brings that opportunity, I think. Thanks.
Thanks. And Taylor, just to respond to you, I think this is an important question. I just want to jump on to what you just said. The role of bringing in private sector finance also lies in the public sector arena in terms of policies, incentives, regulations that will attract the private sector in. In this regard, for example, from the World Bank side, we have carried out market studies in several countries, like Malaysia, for example, where we sought to understand that if plastic is, as we hypothesize, a material and has inherent value, why is it then that the private sector is not coming in? And some of the answers lie in the lack of a offtake market and lack of guarantee of feedstock. And so how do we create policies, regulations, incentive systems to build a market? How do you try to incorporate the true costs into the products that are sold, etc., to be able to make it a viable proposition for the private sector to come in? I think this also comes down to looking at, as you said, the business models. What kind of financing models will work for one country versus another, for one type of sector versus another, for one type of resin type versus another? These are not single sector or single solutions. They have to be customized to the specific context. In this regard, one of the things that we are starting to work on, and we will be doing it in collaboration with others, including hopefully OECD, is to think through an investment toolkit. And that investment toolkit will try to build on our plastic policy simulator to try to see if we can help to inform countries on given their plastic context, given their prioritization of policies, what kinds of asset classes of finance would be best suited to the solutions that they are choosing. This is our intention and hope, because I think that particular combination of seeing what will be financed from public sector, what can be financed from private sector, what can be financed in a blended finance form, as well as a lot of new kinds of financing that's come in, such as philanthropic finance, impact investors, etc. Thank you.
And Ugo, I will turn over the mic to you for your contribution to this, as well as your thoughts on the good question from the Global Alliance for Incinerator Alternatives. Thank you.
Thank you. I knew that would come at the price. Thank you. And I think I can be fairly brief. A lot of the elements that I was going to mention have just been mentioned by the colleague from the World Bank. I think I will reflect on it based on my experience as in the regulatory field, where the answer by industry and investment is investment will actually react to regulatory and policy environments in the first place. And secondly, investment will react to the fact whether there is an economic comparative advantage in unsustainable behavior and business models. And that is still the case today. So I think if you relate that to what we might want to do in the international treaty, is to provide that regulatory environment at the global level that will provide an incentive for aligning investment and finance with the objectives in that sense. So I think we need to take certain issues out of the competitive space. That's sort of one of the issues that could help. I think the question of the role of waste management, because that's how I take the question about incineration. I think that in the sense that we're working in the towards such a treaty is to establish mechanisms, standards, rules, norms that will actually play in favor of a productive use of all the materials and products that we have in the economy. And in that sense, treating the global treaty as has been said by many, as a circularity treaty is key in that regard. And I think we will have to pay attention to anything that might be construed by members or parties to the future agreement as deviating from that principle. That's all I would say. That one. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thanks to all of you, to our panelists and to our audience. This was a really thought-provoking conversation. I hope we can keep it up over the week to come. I think that's our time today. So thank all of you for coming.
Okay, thanks very much, Liz, and to all the panelists for kicking off this afternoon session with a really, as you said, thought-provoking and rich discussion. I'm Jo Tyndall, the Director of the Environment Directorate here at the OECD, and I'm going to take us straight into this second session, chemicals in plastics. It is a real pleasure to welcome everybody to this session. Now, we've all seen some pretty distressing images of plastic litter destroying pristine and fragile ecosystems around the world. Unfortunately, this is only the visible aspect of the global plastic pollution problem. The chemicals and polymers that make up plastic products can't be seen with the naked eye, but they can have extremely harmful impacts on both human health and on the natural environment. Now, just one example, chemicals used as flame retardants in plastics have been regulated because of their toxicity to aquatic organisms. Other chemicals have been regulated due to their effects on the development, on human development. which is certainly a serious problem. So it's not an easy issue to resolve because these substances are relied on in creating a number of products and processes that we use in many cases on a daily basis. And the chemicals and polymers used are what makes plastics essentially customizable. So they can be adjusted, altered for different end uses. Chemical dyes provide plastics in an array of wonderful colors, for example. Chemical plasticizers make plastics bendable, and the type of polymer you choose is going to influence your product's durability. So that's just some examples. We clearly need to balance the functionality of plastic products against sustainability concerns. And that in turn means we have to carefully assess the sustainability of the chemicals and polymers used in their production. Establishing sound chemical management beyond plastics is by no means a new idea being addressed at the international level. And many of you will already be familiar with the negotiations of the UN International Framework for the Sound Management of Chemicals and Waste. And that framework is set to be agreed at the 5th International Conference on Chemicals Management being held in September this year. So the UN discussions highlight the continued need for countries to implement national frameworks for chemicals management and to ensure that product value chains include safer, sustainable solutions. And all this, as I think we heard in the previous session, has to be underpinned by robust transparency to monitor and report on these efforts. And importantly, the Plastics Treaty has the potential to be a real catalyst for much needed regulation in this area as well. So we're going to explore these issues in more detail with the aim of supporting the development of an international legally binding instrument to end plastic pollution. And we're going to dive into how to leverage principles of sustainable chemistry and sustainable design for plastics, and how to establish robust chemicals management systems. We've convened a panel of experts to bring their different perspectives, 3 from international government organizations and 2 discussants representing different stakeholder interests. So to make maximum use of the time we have available, I'm going to launch straight into a discussion with the first panelist. Now, I haven't even had a chance to look around to see who's sitting where, so I might look in the wrong direction. But I want to first introduce Jacqueline Alvarez, the Chief of the Chemicals and Health Branch from UNEP, the United Nations Environment Programme, who's going to, as I understand it, speak to UNEP's recent report on the science of chemicals in plastics. She is online, I've just been told, which is a good reason why I can't see her at the, at the podium here. So please, Jacqueline, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much. I don't know if you are listening, if you can hear me. Can you please confirm? Hello?
Yes, we can hear you. We can hear you, so please continue.
Oh, okay. Thank you. Thank you very much. So, and thank you. I am extending my gratitude, as others did before, to OECD for organizing this event. And we are going to present the chemicals in plastics, and in a way trying to address those elements that sometimes are invisible to our eyes because of how plastics are formed and how plastics are produced. As was very brilliantly expressed before, how in a way those properties that we look for can also be very challenges for us afterwards. So if you can please go to the next slide. So this is a publication, the one I'm going to share the highlights with you today, that has been jointly developed by UNEP, the United Nations Environment Programme, together with the Basel, Rotterdam and Stockholm Convention Secretariat. It is a technical report, and we have had authors from the International Pollution Control Panel preparing the different chapters. The publication aims to inform the global community about the often overlooked chemicals related issues on plastic pollution, particularly their adverse impacts on human health and the environment. But it's also addressing the topic from a perspective of resource efficiency and circularity. We have heard words like functionality, benefits, essentiality, and the report, though it's not entering into those aspects, is trying to give an understanding of where we stand. Based on compelling scientific evidence, the report highlights that it is urgently needed action, and it also outlines some possible areas for those actions to be concentrated on. It aims mainly to help discussions in the negotiation process, and my pleasure is today to really give you a snapshot of what the publication contains. You see also in the slides the link to the web page. If you can please go to the... So what were the objectives of this publication? We talk that science is basic, that science is at the core, and the publication is trying to really provide the scientific evidence that can give us, shed some light on the different aspects. It is also trying to close some knowledge gaps related to chemicals in plastics, particularly with a focus group of them, which is the additives, including considerations on the environmental fate, but also on potential or related human and environmental impacts. There are some levers identified, and in a way, our objective as the environment agency in the world is to really support a toxic-free circular economy. We heard several times today that circular economy approaches are essential. We heard numbers about also how things will be doubled or tripled. So in a way, it is very important to see what is invisible to our eyes in the aspects of chemicals. If you can go please to the next slide. So I'm going to, in a way, go very quickly on some part of the methodology. So this started with an extensive literature review, and two main studies were in a way guiding the discussions, and the process to prepare the report also consisted of consultative moments where inputs from different experts included. The next slide. So as you have heard several times, and you know very well, the anatomy of plastics is very interesting. So plastics are made of chemicals, and that includes polymers, additives, non-intentionally added substances such as, for example, impurities, as in any practically every single manufacturing processes. Some, for example, are leftover cleaning agents and recycling. You also see that to have a plastic, it is not only putting together chemicals, but it's also providing certain properties that are needed depending on the functionality that we are looking for. So in the case of additives, what we have is that can really make the products stronger, softer, colorful, or fire resistant, as it was also mentioned before with the flame retardance characteristics. Plastics have become part of our lives, essential in many things, and the properties that they are in a way bringing us versatility and low costs are sometimes those that are bringing us the whole concerns that we have because of the chemicals that are in there. The next slide. So what are the key findings here? And You see the numbers in the slides, and this is, of course, in a way, some information that needs to be considered in the context of the negotiations with smart and intelligent approaches. So, as I said, chemicals are integral part of. Over 13,000 substances have been associated with plastics in the review literature for this report, either for the use in the production aspects or detected in plastic materials afterwards in the consumer products that we use. These 13,000 chemicals that are associated with plastics and plastic productions is across a wide range of applications. So more than 3.2K monomers, so 3,200 monomers, additives, processing aids, non-intentional added substances are of potential concern. So around 1/4 of the whole amount of chemicals or substances that has been identified or associated with plastics, it can be toxic, can in a way have those substances and properties that we don't want. These properties, unfortunately, include carcinogenicity, mutagenicity, reproductive toxicity, specific target organs toxicity, endocrine disruption, ecotoxicity, bioaccumulation, environmental persistence, mobility issues. They can walk or move long distances, and be found in remote locations. So the invisible part of the chemicals can be everywhere, and we will not see them in, for example, our biota or in the pictures or photographs that we have seen of our environment being polluted in the oceans. But the substances, those chemicals are still there. Plastics can also serve as carriers of, for example, antimicrobial resistance. So there is a huge area that it's chemical related as well as physical related, but that part I think is much well known. So in addition to certain monomers, 10 groups of chemicals, and that is based on chemistry, on uses or on sources, are identified as being of major concern, again, due to high toxicity or the potential to migrate, to be released, and that includes the flame retardants, UV stabilizers, for example, the PFAs, phthalates, biphenyls, biocides, certain metals and metalloids, PAHs, and many others that non-intentionally added substances. How do we address chemicals in the new treaty? How do we ensure we will not be lagging behind? How are we going to discuss with a comprehensive approach and use the existing discussions in an efficient manner? Those are questions for next week, but not only for next week, for the years to come as well. We have, for example, the POPs, the persistent organic pollutants, under the POP-ROC, the POPs Review Committee, which started to address certain groups of chemicals, and then with possibilities of having continuous revisions and reviews. If you can please go to the next slide. So why do we call that these substances are chemicals of concerns? It's because they can impact our health and our environment. These 3,200 chemicals that I have been mentioning can mimic, can block, can alter, for example, the hormones, reduce fertility, damage the nervous system, cause cancer. The phthalates, for example, are a group that have already been identified as endocrine disrupting chemicals. Some are also related to loss of the IQ points with intellectual disability, also bringing reduction of economic possibilities in the countries. So all of the things that we heard in the session before have, in a way, needs to be featured in when we are discussing and addressing the issue of chemicals in plastics as well. Not as a surprise, you will see that women and children are particularly susceptible to this toxic chemical. That is also something that needs to be sometimes will need to be recognized, considering populations at risks. But men are not spared either. There is research already ongoing about detrimental effects, particularly on male fertility, due to combined exposures of these chemicals that are associated with plastics. The next slide. So the bad thing or the good thing is that the chemicals of concern can be released from the plastics along its entire life cycle. So it is not only at the moment where the plastics become a waste, but it's also in different moments in their life cycle. Some chemicals pose significant challenges to technological solutions, to plastics recycling, and to circularity, therefore contaminating new products that can or are made from recycled plastics. So considerations also on those areas are essential to be discussed by member states and negotiators the weeks to come, the year to come. The next slide, please. So call for action. You have heard me saying repeatedly that evidence exists, but evidence also calls us for urgent action to address the chemicals in the plastics. And this is not only to protect the human health at this moment, but also the future generations. We really need to strive for transition to a toxic-free and sustainable circular economy. It is very important to prevent and minimize the use of chemicals of concern in plastics. Of course, when functionality, when essentiality might not be a problem. And if that's the case, how can we ensure that we have the right substitutions or alternatives so that is not longer happening? Ensuring access to information and raising awareness on chemicals in plastics along the value chain also becomes as one of the priorities. We need to know, those that are in the value chains need to know what are they in a way using for their products. Both upstream and downstream is essential in here. Building capacities, building partnerships is something that we understand as also very, very important. Having said this, we cannot stop strengthening the research and the monitoring of chemicals in plastics, particularly because some information relates to the substance itself, but sometimes not to the mixtures of the chemicals in the plastics. The next slide, please. So not everything is bad. We have good news. There are solutions and alternatives can happen. You have seen that in the Stockholm Convention, for example, some of the chemicals that are being listed are chemicals that has some kind of use in the plastic cycles, and some regulations and some alternatives and feasible things are happening. Transition only can be successful if there is a combined effort by all stakeholders. We heard that in the previous session for finance. It's not only for finance, it's also, as we also heard, for regulatory authorities, for manufacturers, for users, for waste managers, for recyclers, and as well as for consumers that are in a way helping and being able to change the paradigms in these things. The next slide, please. So again, good news. We were very, in a way, thrilled last UNEA in March 22, when our member states, the UNEP member state, welcomed the framework manual for green and sustainable chemistry. And those manuals include 10 objectives and guiding considerations so that we can move to sustainable design. And that is to help not only one side of the chain, but all stakeholders in their approaches. This guiding considerations range molecular design to maximizing social benefits, to encouraging chemistry innovations, but also trying to address and not minimize the social challenges and of course the environmental challenges. At the end of the day, the objectives are to promote innovation, to really go into the full potential of chemistry besides what we do today. Applied to plastics, yes. Applied to chemicals in products, yes. So the potential here is really broad and to be fully considered. The next slide, please. Can you still hear me?
Jacqueline, yes, we can. I'm conscious of
So,
time, though. I'm conscious
maybe
of time.
a quick
So hopefully
summary on
we'll
overview.
be able to wrap up soon.
Okay. Oh, okay. Okay, so chemicals of concern have been found in plastics across a wide range of sectors and product value chain, including, unfortunately, toys and other children products, packaging, as you know very well, including for food contact materials, electrical and electronic equipments, vehicles, textiles, furniture, pharmaceuticals, household products, agriculture, fisheries. So they are all over our what we know as our modern life. The next one. So ending plastic pollutions. You have heard there is a lot to address. We need to close the tap, yes, but we also need to deal with what we have today, not only the legacy that is already with us, but also the legacy that the things that will start to happen. So reduce, reuse, recycle, reorient, diversify. Policy regulatory frameworks are essentials to make the change and to shift the situation that we are today. So with this, thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much for that. I think that set the scene very, very well. And it's abundantly clear that the hazards associated with chemicals in plastic products are issues that affect every single one of us in the room and online today. But good that you balanced the very disturbing and worrying picture with some solutions that followed on nicely from the first session, talking about turning off the tap and rethinking the plastics production cycle or system upon which we've based things. Now, this is a good segue, given the cooperation between UNEP and the BRS Secretariat, because we're going to hear next from Kay Ono, who's Senior Coordination Officer of the Basel, Rotterdam and Stockholm Conventions Secretariat. And she's going to highlight elements of the convention's recent report on the governance of chemicals and plastics. So, Kay, over to you.
Thank you very much. Thanks to OECD for giving us this opportunity to speak today. Good afternoon. Bonjour à tous. Just freshly coming back from 2 weeks long conference de parties to the BRF conventions. I'll be happy to report some key elements from that meeting, as well as our recently published report. Let's try. Is this all right? Yes. So I'll be talking about, oops, I think I did twice. How do I go back? All right. Yeah, the publication entitled Global Governance of Plastics and Associated Chemicals, funded by the government of Norway. We had Karen and Nico as the author of this publication, and thanks to many technical experts' review, it was recently published that mapping the global governance landscape for the management of chemicals of concern used in plastics, and also outlines options for a global plastics agreement to address chemicals of concern. This is particularly important, as Jacqueline highlighted, that in order to ensure safe circularity and prevent harmful chemicals from entering recycling streams. So, persistent organic pollutants. Those are among the most hazardous chemicals found in plastics. A group of organic compounds that possess characteristics of persistence, bioaccumulation, potential for long-range environmental transport, and adverse effects. And many of them are endocrine disrupting chemicals indeed. So as you sit back and listen to my presentation, please be imaginative and consider how it could be applicable to chemicals in plastics that might fall under the purview of new treaty, including like aspects such as the scope of chemicals, procedures, and criteria for adding new chemicals and control measures. I'm still struggling to go to the next slide. There you go. So what is the decision-making flow for listing a chemical in Annex A, B, and or C to the Stockholm Convention? So it starts with a party submitting a proposal for listing new chemical, and then the POPs review committee, this is a scientific subsidiary body, decides whether the proposal fulfills the screening criteria in Annex D. Then the next step, the committee develops a risk profile in accordance with Annex E information and decides whether, this is very important text, the chemical is likely, as a result of its long-range environmental transport, to lead to significant adverse human health and or environmental effects such that global action is warranted. So the chemical needs to travel long distance, and that is why global action is needed. It's not enough if each country take action. And then it's also important to indicate, based on scientific information, that the chemical is significantly causing adverse effects such that global action is warranted. And this very important decision is taken by the POPs review committee, and then it goes to the next stage whereby the committee undertakes socioeconomic assessment. Then it looks at the risk management evaluation and then identify possible control measures, for example, availability of alternatives and so on. And based on these two different set of information, scientific information, the chemical characteristic information, and the socioeconomic information, the committee makes recommendation on listing. The final stage is the conference of parties to decide whether it should be listed in Annex A, B, or C. So it takes about 4 years in this one. And how this process was developed was that at INC 1 of Stockholm Convention, the Intergovernmental Negotiating Committee established a criteria expert group for persistent organic pollutants to prepare and present to INC 4 proposals for science-based criteria and the procedure for identifying additional POPs for future international action. So INC 1 adopted the terms of reference for this criteria expert group, which was open to government designated experts, also open to observers. And then the INC 1 elected co-chairs and rapporteur for this criteria expert group, which was the bureau for this group. And through the work of this criteria expert group, Article 8 of the Stockholm Convention and Annex D, E, F to the convention that provides information requirements and criteria and so on and so forth have been developed during this negotiation period. Then following this procedure and criteria, 22 new chemicals have been added to the initial 12 chemicals in Annex A, B, and C to the convention. So Annex A is for elimination. There's a time-limited specific exemption, but basically parties needs to stop producing, using, importing, exporting, and manage those waste in an environmentally sound manner. Annex B is for restriction, like DDT. There is a critical use, so it is an acceptable purpose whereby you can use this chemical for a longer term. Annex C is unintentional releases. And as I said, there is this procedure for adding new chemicals. So currently there are 3 chemicals that are under review. And in red, methoxychlor, Decloran Plus, and UV328 Those three were added at the 2 weeks ago conference the parties to the Stockholm Convention. And Decloran Plus and UB328 are plastic additives. So how many chemicals are covered under the Stockholm Convention? It is safe to say that as of May 2023, 34 chemicals or groups of chemicals are listed in Annex A, B, or C, which are subject to control measures aimed at reducing or eliminating their releases. But I would like to make 2 points here in terms of numbers. Number of chemicals, 34 chemicals, of which 17 are plastic additives or used in manufacture or contaminants or byproducts. And when we say groups, so PFOA related compounds, for example, has identified more than 350 CAS numbers. PFHXS related compounds has 150 CAS numbers. PFOS precursors has 96 precursors in the proposal. And when you get to congeners like polychlorinated naphthalenes, there are a large number of possible congeners, PCB as well. So 34, you say it, but actually there should be more than 500, 600, it could even reach to 1,000 chemicals, if you also count congeners as one chemical. Then what does it mean by covered under the convention? So chemicals listed in Annex A, B, or C are subject to control measures, which means that parties shall do so and so, eliminate or prohibit production, restrict production, take measures to reduce. But in these articles, they always refer to chemicals listed in Annex A or B or C. It doesn't say persistent organic pollutants. On the other hand, there are other articles such as Article 9 on information exchange, Article 11 on research, development, and monitoring. They refer to persistent organic pollutants instead of saying chemicals listed in Annex A, B, or C. What does it mean? So there are many other chemicals with POPs-like characteristics that are not listed in Annex A, B, or C to the convention. So they could be either currently under review, but not yet listed, or do not meet the criteria for listing under the convention, like it's not as persistent or doesn't bioaccumulate, or do not have enough information to determine, or no parties have submitted the proposal for listing. So for example, polyaromatic hydrocarbons, PAHs, polybrominated dibenzoyl dioxins and furans, or linear alkyl benzenes, these are in detergents, nonyl phenols, octyl phenols, those are highly used plastic additives, but they are not that persistent, but they are also organic chemicals. So, and there are several of PFAS that are not listed in Annex A, B, C, PBDs, brominated diphenylethers, not listed in Annex A, B, C. So those chemicals could be under the purview of new treaty, and then you will need to consider what will be the relationship with the Stockholm Convention eventually. Now, let's look at this governance report. It says that figure 1, I can't really point out, but in the orange part, it says 3,200, just like Jacqueline has mentioned. There are chemicals of concern in plastics, about 3,000 identified, of which that black part is internationally regulated. It's very difficult to see, but in the right-hand side pie chart, it mentions Stockholm Convention 100. But hold on a minute, right? I just mentioned that the 350 identified as related compounds. And so there are some challenges in counting numbers, but it's clear that there are many chemicals of concern not addressed internationally. So in the global governance report, it analyzes in governance in the 4 primary life cycle phases: extraction phase, chemical phase, material phase, and dematerialization phase. And in the dematerialization phase, I am very happy to inform you that the last conference, the parties to the Basel Convention, adopted the technical guidelines on the environmentally sound management of plastic waste, addressing the plastic waste amendments adopted in 2019. These technical guidelines provides guidance on environmentally sound management, such as EPR, transboundary movement requirements, prevention, minimization, handling, separation, collection, final disposal, etc. So while the dematerialization phase may be covered, the mid phase or upstream phase have been identified as having more gaps. And in order to close those governance gaps, the report identifies few ideas. For example, developing international sustainability criteria that addresses transparency and traceability. And then developing a global approach for identifying, addressing, and providing transparency by including grouping of chemicals, etc. Now, how is the transparency and traceability of POPs in products and articles ensured? Here is Article 6, paragraph 1 of the Stockholm Convention. It provides that each party shall develop appropriate strategies for identifying stockpiles or products and articles in use containing POPs, I mean chemicals listed in Annex A, B, or C, and identify to the extent practicable stockpiles consisting or containing chemicals listed in Annex A or B. However, at the last COP, it was acknowledged that the parties are facing challenges in implementing these obligations. And especially when discussing about listing of UV 3 to 8 and Declorant Plus. So the COP tasked the POPs Review Committee to consider what are the options for the identification. Now that new global treaty may be considering how to ensure transparency and traceability, it might be helpful to think about what is it being implemented for one of the most harmful plastic additives, which are persistent organic pollutants. And this is my last slide, sorry. So there are key messages for mapping, and of which I would like to highlight science policy interface. Scientific information indeed will bridge the policy development and decision making, and it's very important in this process. So I believe that clear and transparent communication of scientific findings and policy implications will foster better understanding and trust and informed decision making. So I look forward to seeing more active science policy interaction in the negotiation of this new treaty. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Kay, for that really full explanation, both of the conventions, but also the governance report. You've really emphasized the transboundary impacts that require truly global action, and took good note of your key messages at the end, really emphasizing transparency, but also the need to operate on the basis of the science policy nexus. So happy now to introduce Eva Lenaya from the OECD's Chemicals Program, who's going to speak to the work the OECD has conducted on the sustainable design of plastics from a chemical perspective. Hopefully also elements from the long-standing OECD's Chemicals Program that can be leveraged in the context of the upcoming discussions. Eva, over to you.
Great, thank you for the introduction, and also it's nice to follow up collaborating IGOs on chemicals, as it's an area of passion for all of us. So I'll just start off here with sharing a joke that anybody in the chemicals regulation area has heard. So why does everyone hate chemicals? Because they make up everything. And as you've heard today, plastics are also making up more and more of the products in our society. And hence the importance to continue to ensure and improve proper management of chemicals to protect human health and the environment. And not just at the product level, like we've heard, but across the life cycle of plastic production to the end of life. So some of you may know, but others might not, that the OECD has been working on chemical safety issues with countries and other stakeholders for more than 50 years. And so there are elements of the work done here at the OECD and from other IGOs that can be leveraged in the context of the plastics treaty negotiations. So for example, back in 1991, there was a definition of a polymer that was agreed upon at the OECD that has been incorporated into a number of different regulatory schemes around the world. In the early 1990s, we also had discussions on criteria for identifying polymers of low concern that have been implemented also in many regulations to identify where reduced regulatory attention is needed on some types of polymers. We also have developed over the years a number of test guidelines, but also on biodegradability. So these can also be leveraged in thinking about identifying biodegradability of different polymers. So hearing about all the work that's done in the different IGOs and also nationally on chemicals management, why are we still having challenges with chemicals management in plastics? And it's not unique to plastics. Well, one element is about chemical management systems. So if we look at this map here, all the green dots show where a country has chemicals legislation in place. In yellow, they're being developed. In red, there is no legislation in place for industrial and consumer chemicals. And for the other countries, it's unknown. And this is something that the OECD is tracking. And so it's important to continue to have countries develop robust chemical management systems because that will help also with improving the safety of plastics. So along with this challenge is the complexity. You've heard the complexity about the numbers of chemicals that we're dealing with, but also the evolving science about their hazards, their use, their exposures, and their risks. So we need to keep introduce more of these management systems across countries, but also improve the ones that we have so they can be more proactive and not chasing always legacy issues. And so sustainable chemistry can be a way that we have more proactive chemicals management to look at more efficient, effective, more environmentally benign chemicals and processes. And sustainable chemistry also takes into account this life cycle thinking, encompassing design, manufacture, use, and end of life. So at the OECD, we've also done work on sustainable chemistry and also in the context of chemical selection and substitution, because we're making chemical selection decisions all the time. And sometimes maybe not without even realizing it. So if a product or process engineer decides that they want to make a particular material or product or change their process, they're actually making a chemical selection decision. Or if we're substituting one chemical for another because it's been regulated, we're making a chemical selection decision. And so we need to have more proactive thinking in the context of this decision making to have more proactive and protective approaches. So some of the guidance that the OECD has released on this includes guidance on key considerations for selecting safer substitutes. We also have reports just released earlier this year on cross-country approaches for substitution of chemicals. Third-party lessons learned from third-party approaches for substitution, as well as economic instruments that could be used to incentivize substitution. Where we've gone beyond the safer aspect has also been on our work in plastics. And so this is work that we have also done in collaboration with Peter and colleagues in their working party on resource productivity and waste. And in this report, A Chemicals Perspective on Designing with Sustainable Plastics, we really focused on embedding sustainable chemistry thinking at the design stage. So providing information for designers to take into account about how their chemical selection considerations really can impact human health and the environment all along the life cycle. So if they're choosing a specific chemical to use in a plastic, this impacts impacts human health and the environment all the way from the source materials used to the production and manufacture and to the end of life. So the report, which there's some available at the back if you'd like a copy, articulates the design principles of sustainable chemistry and engineering. So maximizing resource efficiency, eliminating and minimizing hazards and pollution, designing using a systems-based approach and with life cycle thinking. Then it talks about how at the design stage, designers can marry their product design goals with also sustainable design goals, looking at inherently low risk and hazard materials, selecting materials that have a commercial afterlife, selecting materials that generate no waste, also looking to use secondary feedstocks or bio-based feedstocks. And then it provides a number of tips for looking across the different life cycle phases. And of course, this systems-based approach increases the complexity. And so this makes decision-making even more difficult. And there are trade-offs. So for example, a designer might be wanting to use a specific color at the use stage, but then that would impede recycling. Or you may want to reduce your water consumption at the production stage, but then you might need to use a different formulation of chemicals, which would have a different exposure or environmental or other impacts. So using the system-based approach will help come up with better decision-making, but it's also much more complex. So what we did after we released that report, we then had a workshop looking at the economic, regulatory, technical barriers to this type of sustainable design, focusing specifically on food grade plastic packaging. And I'll point out this report to you, and I think the more detailed analysis is actually in the annexes of this report, where industry highlights their challenges to using this type of approach and the challenges to implementation. And also there's another annex which looks at the policy approaches that countries have already put into place or are putting in place for sustainable design in the context of flexible food grade plastic packaging, focusing on a chemical lens. And then another study that we hope will also help people thinking about chemicals and plastics is we're developing currently a synthesis report on cost-efficient chemical content validation of recycled plastics. So there's transparency, of course, key. And also, but there's also mixing of plastics at the recycling stage. So looking at what are the standards in place and what substances are covered and the technical methods used so we can have cost-effective and scalable methods to analyze these recyclates. So as my final slide, there are a number of policy solutions that we can have for more sustainable chemical management solutions, including in the plastic space. So increasing the number of chemical management frameworks in place, but making them more proactive, focusing on sustainable design and greener chemistries, linking risk management and innovation so that we find substitutes for the substances that we're banning, having financial measures that increase financing for sustainable chemistry and economic instruments that incentivize substitution. And finally, furthering the education of chemists and engineers about the toxicological and environmental impacts of their decisions. So thank you for the opportunity to provide this background.
Thank you, Eva. And again, I think having listened to everybody, there's an enormous amount we could cover, and really interesting, for example, to hear about the trade-offs that need to be made in thinking about sustainable design from a chemicals perspective. I'm very conscious we are due to finish, and we're supposed to have an on-time finish of this session. So we've only got 5 minutes left, but I don't want to cut the two discussants short. So let's move straight there. And we've asked them to talk about the importance of robust management of chemicals and plastics, how we can ensure alignment with other ongoing activities, both at the domestic and international levels. So first, we have Vito Buonsante, the Technical and Policy Advisor at International Pollutants Elimination Network, or IPEN. Please, Vito, you have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for everybody presenting before me, all the very interesting work done by BRS, UNEP, and OECD. My reflection is that finally we're talking about chemicals when we talk about plastics, and we can share those inside jokes that people, nerds that work on chemicals don't usually get to share with the broader public. So I hope you enjoy them. But my first consideration is that these background reports and studies are really kind of shifting a bit our perspective on when we look at plastics. In the previous panel, we were hearing more talking about plastic pollution as defined more as leakage and as the solution being still waste management and more recycling, despite the difficulties that these solutions have had in the past. So maybe what a better what we need to do, like to advance, and I think the question was like, how can the treaty help bring forward the agenda on chemical management, is first of all the fact that we need to consider plastic in a different way. Plastics are not all the same, and as Jacqueline said in her presentation, plastics are chemicals. Polymers are chemicals, and the additives that make the functions of the plastics are obviously chemicals, and many of these are toxic. So not all these plastics are the same, and so we need to change the way in which we make these plastics, and the treaty should be instrumental to this. And this should help us to think about the measures in the treaty rather than thinking about plastics as a problem of waste, but thinking about, again, this life cycle. What does it mean, the life cycle? It means that probably we need to look much more upstream rather than downstream. So how do we solve this problem? Well, there's a couple of things that we need to do. One of them, it was mentioned, and it's transparency. If we don't know what's in the chemical, in the plastics, well, it's going to be very difficult to protect our health. The consideration that plastics are a threat to health should also drive the way we regulate them. And so the transparency should help us in two ways. One, in identifying the chemicals of concern, and two, in avoiding using them, and specifically avoiding using them in ways that can that we can be negatively exposed, especially for vulnerable population. IPEN has produced quite a few reports where we look at recycled plastics that end up in consumer products like toys, like kitchen utensils, and that is largely due to the fact, first of all, that they're used. Probably they should not be used. And second, that they are very difficult to trace. So that is one challenge that we have that needs to be finally, that gap needs to be finally closed. The second is to start to systematically identify and substitute chemicals that are hazardous and that are found in plastics. The UNEP report, the BRS report, they recognize a few of these toxic chemicals, and we've seen how already the Stockholm Convention has identified quite many chemicals that are used in plastics, and that approach should be a bit more systematic so that we avoid having large amounts of stockpiles of plastic containing toxic chemicals. I just want to remind that one provision of the Stockholm Convention, which is that POPs should not be recycled. And so if we expand that thinking to all chemicals that are hazardous, we should try to avoid recycling plastics that contain toxic chemicals. A recent report that was issued by Greenpeace a couple of days ago, and that was quite widely covered by the media, presented a large amount of academic studies that testify on how recycling can be toxic. So often we see recycling as something positive, and it should be positive, like resource efficiency, but not if it's spreading more toxic chemicals. And so when we think about, oh, we should go for circular economy approaches, we need to think carefully what circular economy means. If circular economy is just a synonym of recycling, but not of a change of approach, a change of design, as Eva was saying, then we're not going to do, we're not going to progress too much. And so my final consideration around what the plastic treaty should do is both to look at the positive examples from previous MEAs, even if they cover a very small amount of the 13,000 chemicals that are used in plastics, and the 3,200 chemicals that are known to be hazardous. But there's also 6,000 chemicals that we don't know much about. And usually what happens is that when there are chemicals that we don't know much about, and we get rid of a chemical that we know enough about, the substitution, what we in the chemical world call regrettable substitution, we substitute a known hazardous chemicals with some unknown chemical that in many cases, unfortunately, ends up being hazardous. And that's maybe a lesson from the past that we should learn. And as there are so many chemicals for which there is no publicly available data, and we maybe go back to the issue of transparency and availability of data, one thing that we should avoid is to use in materials that we all get in contact with, that our kids get in contact with, that vulnerable population get in contact with, that pregnant women get in contact with, are exposing, that we are exposed to unknown chemicals. That should not be acceptable. Nobody should be exposed to something whose hazard is unknown. So probably we should apply the no data, no market principle also to chemicals. And probably the plastic treaty can start with these lessons learned, and maybe between now and November, or between INC3 and INC4, we can see some progress on and take into account this consideration. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much for those remarks, and noted in particular the need to look upstream from the waste management end of things, and also your last point about dealing with the known unknowns, and not putting people needlessly in danger. We're already over our time, and I don't want to encroach into the last session. So that, unfortunately, I'm sorry, means we're not going to have time for questions, but I do want to give the floor to our final discussant, who is Piet Vermeersch, the Sustainability Director of Plastics Europe.
Thank you so much. It's Piet, by the way. No worries.
I knew I was probably going to mangle a pronunciation somewhere along the way, so apologies, Piet.
I'm from Belgium, that's why I was sitting there. But so first of all, Eva. Sorry. Eva, it's such a pity that Jacqueline Alvarez is physically not here, because I would have loved to meet her in person, because she had such a great topic to present. And well, I hope that she's still listening. But for sure, Key will hear what we want to say. First of all, many thanks for this great initiative, and reaching out to us, because definitely enabling us to participate in this panel is key to us. It's important to have basically a dialogue with our industry. And so I have the honor to present Plastics Europe, which is basically representing the plastic industry of Europe, as being said. I've been working for 22 years for petrochemicals and plastics on a global basis. And I recently took up the challenge basically to lead a strategic council with a great team of experts, actually, working on the sustainable use of plastics. So we're really shifting to the societal aspect of our industry. Now, you need to realize that people don't know this, and this is why I would like to convey this message. There is a kind of a new wind going to our industry, a wind of awareness and acknowledgement that there are issues, that we are willing to act. So that's why the dialogue is important. Issues which we are confronted with, and indeed, like Ms. Alvarez presented, topic like additives in plastics. Now, like pointed out, additives in plastics are needed today to enhance, like you pointed out in the beginning as well, to enhance performance in polymers and have quite some several functionalities. It was clearly raised, and the UNEP report, very interesting reports. I really invite you to read it. It listed indeed these 13,000 substances where 3,200 could raise a concern or are being identified as being raising a concern. Now, a word which has dropped so many times during this session is transparency. Now, what I heard as well is Ms. Alvarez was quoting at some point of time, not everything is bad on plastics. And actually, out of this 1,000 listeners, I think most of it virtually, of course, my MD is listening, and quite some members are here as well. Also, American colleagues are here, or at least listening. But there's a kind of good news. I just came back this week from a European board meeting where we put on the table actually to launch an initiative on an additive project. And the idea is indeed to get towards more transparency in the use of additives. We think it's going to be important to set up a kind of a database and to have basically a good risk assessment on those additives. And to share basically information amongst us and to see in what way we could indeed change or substitute some of those substances. So this is a key message we want to convey, is that we're working on this. We recognize it, but of course, it's important to have still a dialogue together with the outside world, together with you, with UNEP, in basically coming up to the convention anytime soon. It's important that we realize that plastics are part of our world and still will be tomorrow. Imagine we all just came out of this terrible period of COVID-19. What would you have done without these masks? It would have been different. So plastics will be there tomorrow. And maybe a last message. So it's very important that the dialogue again is there, not only on a global level, but also continental, and actually as well national level. And maybe as a last point, and this is just an invite as well to Vito, who was mentioning about toys and the safety of plastics. I hope one day, I have 2 children, 2 princesses, 2 girls in their 20s. I hope one day to be as well a grandfather. For sure, I would very much look forward that maybe one day as well, they will continue to play with, and the idea is not to make any advertisement here, but to play with things, toys like Lego or Playmobil or things like that, or a joystick from PlayStation. I think tomorrow there will still be plastics and we need the plastics, but for sure, also myself, as together with our industry, we want safe plastics in our world.
Well, thank you so much, Pete. And I think that was a really good way and affirming way to end the session. And great to know that you're taking the societal aspects on board and are onto it. So really good final comments. I'm not going to attempt to summarize. I'm going to finish by thanking very, very warmly all our panelists. Jacqueline, I understand her train was late. She would have been here in person. You could have had the opportunity to meet her, but unfortunately, the transport system let us all down.
I hope I will meet her one day.
Yeah. So thank you all very much indeed. And I'm going to pass over to Julia. Julia is going to be moderating the final of our 3 sessions today. Thank you.
So hello everyone, my name is Julia Nielsen. I'm the Deputy Director here on Trade and Agriculture, and it's a great pleasure to be here. Now I know I'm competing in that coveted late Friday afternoon slot, I contemplated telling you all there was a surprise cyclone outside to make sure that I wasn't competing with a nice spring day in Paris. But look, the trade angle has an awful lot to do with this discussion. And when we first think about trade and plastics, we realize we're not just talking about the trade in the plastic thing itself. We're talking about everything that happens upstream in the chemicals, in all the production and manufacture that goes into creating that plastics. We're also talking about embodied plastic trade, the incidental plastics that actually come in the packaging or surround the trade in other things. And of course, as we know, we're looking at the end of life trade in plastics, and one woman's waste is another woman's secondary materials. But so there's 4 types of trade that really come along this value chain. And within that, we see that there's actually lots of ways in that trade can intersect with the reduce, reuse, recycle agenda. And trade policy is all about incentives. So sometimes it intersects positively and sometimes it can intersect negatively. And this is what the panel today is here to discuss. So I have 2 panelists who are online. I have one who's stuck in traffic and another 2 who are here. So hopefully my online presenter, without further ado, let me move first to Daniel Ramos, who's from the World Trade Organization, who's going to talk to us about the trade issues that come up in the issue of international plastics management. So Daniel, if you are online, I'll move straight to you.
Yes, I am. I was trying to turn on my camera, but I couldn't. They said the host stopped it, but I'll just go and then hopefully you have the displeasure of seeing my face at some point. Let me share my screen and my presentation. So hopefully you're seeing, and I think now you're also seeing my face probably at some part of the screen. Thank you for inviting us. Thank you for giving me the floor. I'm Daniel Ramos. I work at the Trade and Environment Division of the WTO, and I act as the secretary to the Dialogue on Plastic Pollution. And yes, I was asked to just provide a scene setting on this issue of the interlinkages between trade flows, trade policies, and the issue of plastic pollution. And that's actually the first question that the co-sponsors of the Dialogue on Plastics Pollution at the WTO started with. They understood, as hopefully everybody else, that plastic pollution is a growing economic, environmental health issue, and they wanted to understand what are the entry points of trade in these discussions. And for the first year of discussions, that's what they did. They convened quite a few meetings, invited experts, including, of course, the OECD, but UNCTAD and others, to try to see and map out the issue from a trade perspective. And a few things became clear early on. So thanks to a lot of work by UNCTAD and also TESS, I understand Caroline is also online. The first thing that they noticed is that trading plastics is much bigger than previously estimated. So more than $1 trillion, I think the figure now for more recent years is $1.2 trillion, or around 5% of global trade. And also that trade is concentrated upstream. There's very little by value in waste, more on volume. But if you look at the values, most of the trade flows in plastics are on primary plastics or in the midstream, and this has been growing. So this is a slide from the end of last year by UNCTAD showing the increase over the years of just the transboundary movement of fruit trade of plastics. We need to be careful always when you use trade data, because there's quite a bit of double counting sometimes, because the plastic that is moved as a primary plastic, then it can be moved again as intermediate or input for other goods. So that we need to take this data for what it is. It does show that the value and the importance of trading plastics for the global economy. But at the same time, on the other hand, it doesn't capture everything. What our delegations noticed early on is that this is only the trade flows of plastics that can be seen through our current trade data. As you may know, we rely on the harmonized system of code identification for goods, and it doesn't include everything. It doesn't include some packaging when it's associated with international trade, not it's in its raw form, but already packaged around the goods. And this is a decision by customs and institutions should do so. And also it doesn't include plastic embedded in goods. So one example that I like to use is when you're importing a car, 40% by volume of it on average is plastics, but you don't see it in the trade data that you're importing plastics that you have to dispose of at the end of life of the product. Of course, some products have more, with embedded plastics, have longer lifespans than others. But they saw clearly that there was a lot of trade happening on plastics, and there was in some points, in some aspects, they were flying blind, and there was need for more transparency there. I just wanted to, because Vito was also in our meeting, or we had a plenary meeting of the discussions there, and IPEN has a recent report on hidden flows of plastics, highlighting those issues with HS codes, etc., which I think is quite useful. Then the second question that they asked themselves is, okay, well, there's a lot of trade in plastic, but where trade policy and we at the WTO, we deal with trade policy makers, what can we do, and where we enter into the frame here, trying to address the issue of plastic pollution. And because I'm in the context of OECD, I'm certain most of you recognize the next slide. This was actually produced in cooperation with OECD colleagues. We had worked before on circular economy, and we tried to transform this mapping of the entry points of trade on circular economy to the realities of plastics. So I won't go into details, but the idea here is just to show that trade in plastics across the life cycle of plastics, trade has an entry point, both in, of course, promoting the use and the movement of these plastic goods, but also potentially on the solutions, or at least efforts to make it more circular. So this was an effort, and we have a factual report of this first year of discussions. This is from 2021, so it dates quite a bit, but it did offer a more or less full picture of these entry points and of the state of knowledge at that point in the discussions at the WTO. So again, there are many opportunities to trading services, for instance, that would help close or bring the loop closer to closing on this issue, but also related to trade in alternatives and substitutes that was already mentioned. I invite you again, hopefully the presentations will be made available. You can have a look at your own pace on all of this first year of mapping where trade enters the debate. Now, after this, there was a ministerial statement at the WTO. Nowadays, at this point, it is supported by 76 WTO members, representing roughly 85% of global trade in plastics. And they decided, okay, we understand that there is a role for us here. We need more transparency. What can we do? And for the last, since the end of 2021, they've been discussing what could be those actions that would help address plastic pollution. And here, I just wanted to take a moment to talk about what are these trade-related measures that could be used to address plastic pollution. Normally, for the non-initiated into the trade jargon, one would quickly think to tariffs as the typical trade measure. And that's true, that's part of it. We have tariffs that are applied to imports of goods. But it's much broader than that. The WTO agreements, they cover a wide variety of trade policies. And one of the things that the dialogue is doing is it launched a survey among the participating members to understand what are the measures they are already adopting. And we could categorize them into three broad types. You have your sustainability requirements. These are bans, restrictions on the importation of certain goods because either they're not recyclable or maybe to control the flow. You have licenses requirements to understand what is coming in. You have any other kind of command and control, as we say, measures that are being put in place to try and reduce plastic pollution. Another big bucket of measures are taxes and other market tools like extended producer responsibility schemes. When they're applied to imports, of course, they become trade tools for us as well, or your typical environmental taxes, a tax on the carbon content of a good, or in this case, the plastic content of a good, etc. And then finally, the third one are a big bucket are support measures. Our measures may be supporting either recycling facilities or promoting goods with recycled content or promoting alternatives and substitutes. And what we see is that members at the WTO participating in this dialogue are already using all of these types of measures to address plastic pollution. I will give you, I have just two more slides. I will give you some examples of where they're getting, but I wanted to expand the perspective of what trade policies are being discussed, because as was mentioned in the introduction, these are the economic levers that trade officials are very used to using, but now apply to trying to address a public good, trying to reduce and eliminate plastic pollution. Now, so far we have about 280 of these trade-related plastic measures mapped by 64 members. And what is interesting is that most of these measures are from developing members. We see a lot of action, and especially in recent years, on using trade tools to address plastic pollution in developing and least developed countries. One thing that we notice is that most of those measures are sustainability requirements. Very few are pricing and market mechanisms and support and financial programs. Now, I don't want to make too much of this information because it is also a feature of how trade agreements and transparency of specific measures are required at the WTO. But in any case, what we do have information on is mostly on these command and control measures. And so the survey, it's still ongoing. It will finish over the summer, and we'll have a proper report analyzing, because the survey asks questions about what are the objectives pursued, what are the needs and challenges to implement these measures, where in the life cycle stage of the plastic product it affects. So there will be more granular information on that. But what I can already tell you is that most of these measures are addressing 5 big topics: single-use plastics, packaging, recycling, eco-design, and waste management. So a lot of the things that were discussed today already. On the discussions had held 2 workshops, which are deep dive discussions on specific topics. And the latest workshop we held was on trade approaches to support reduction efforts. And I put there on the screen, we have a summary of about 22 pages that summarizes let's say, all of the presentations done and discussions and technical information provided, especially from stakeholders, like including the OECD on the topic. And I just wanted to highlight a few things from these discussions. So, for instance, we drill down onto these measures and try to identify what are the specific products that they are targeting most often. And not surprisingly, a big chunk of the measures are applying to packaging, a lot of measures on single-use plastics. And here we drilled out again and tried to identify what specific single-use plastics these trade measures are restricting or controlling. Plastic bags, number 1, followed by tableware, cups, and plastic straws. No surprise there. But we also have quite a few measures on other types of finished goods. And the interesting thing here, and you can have a look at the report, is that even if the measures are addressing sometimes or oftentimes the same products, the way they identify what is an unnecessary or harmful product varies quite a bit. Even on single-use plastic bags, for instance, we find a variation, a big variation on, let's say, only if you take one element, thickness of a plastic bag. It can vary anything from 5 microns being the limit to 100 microns. So there are opportunities for harmonization there. And this is my final slide. Another workshop that we held on trying to summarize these 2 years of discussions and provide like a substantive analysis for discussions at the WTO was on promotion. This is another side of the discussions. What could be trade promotion policies and approaches that would help address plastic pollution, looking at issues like technologies needed for sustainable waste management or alternatives and sustainable and effective alternatives and substitutes. And there, this is a shock and awe slide. It's just, you won't be able to see everything. That's not the objective. But here we started to map out all of the products with, whenever possible, their HS codes that these measures are already, or these discussions are already highlighting as potential sustainable substitutes and alternatives. And here it's a long list of potential products. And in this workshop and in the report, you can see they discuss what are the trade barriers that these might face, or what are the conditions or what are the policies that exist that might be misaligned and make so that these goods that could potentially be used as alternatives or reused products could be assistance, could be alternatives, but what are things that are preventing the uptake and that trade policymakers could do. So I'll stop here. Thank you again for inviting us, and happy to provide more clarifications.
Thank you very much, Daniel. And aside from learning a new acronym, which is always welcome in the trade world, it's very useful to see the range of discussions that are going on. Some of the challenges, especially as we heard in the last session about the importance of transparency in this area and the limitations of the sorts of HS classifications we have in terms of what plastics we can identify and whether we can distinguish between virgin and recycled, but also the large numbers of measures that that members are taking, both positive in terms of services trade, technology moving, substitutes, but also difficult issues around import licenses, import bans, export restrictions, export bans, and different standards across countries. So against that background, that leads me to my next two panelists, who both of whom are well placed to give us some perspective on what this all means in terms of the context of the challenge ahead. So first, I'm going to turn to Carolyn, who's from the Forum on Trade, Environment and the SDGs, TESS. And Carolyn, who's also online, I'd like to ask you, from what we're hearing, what are some of the key trade issues that you think could be addressed in the INC negotiations?
Thank you, Julia, for the introduction. I'm just going to quickly share my screen and then get to your question. Can you see? Oops, sorry. Share screen. Up. Oh gosh.
We can see you, if not your screen, if you'd like to start.
You know, is it possible for you just to skip to Rob and then I'll come back when it's working properly?
Indeed, I will do that. Or unless Daniela, are you okay yet? Or having just, I literally saw you rush in straight from the Paris traffic.
Also, I'm opening my documents, but have to go ahead.
Okay, well, the reason I'm going to turn to Daniela is because you have a role in these discussions in the WTO, except from the perspective of a country. So I'd like to.
Oh, I'm sorry.
So I'd just like to ask you, I mean, what do you see as some of the biggest challenges from a trade perspective in plastics management?
First of all, thank you very much for inviting us to this great event. I'm very happy to be here, and OECD has been working with us in the dialogue of plastic pollution with the 76 members since the very beginning. So in terms of challenges, I might say in the WTO arena, we are usually developing countries taken as norm takers, not norm developers. In this case, in the dialogue started 3 years ago as an initiative of 5 developing members, with one, it's Australia, China, Barbados, Fiji, Ecuador, and Morocco who developed this, together with other developing members. So one of the challenges was to put together from a diversity of perspectives, what was the trade contribution to the response on plastic pollution? And then, of course, the development dimension beyond what is in there for aid for trade and the identification of capacity building and technical assistance in what is trade related poses many challenges. So we have run a survey, and I think Daniel already explained about that, identifying what in terms of trade related capacity building, what is identified as a priority from a developing country perspective and developing countries in their diversity. Another challenge is to have the right data at the right moment to implement the right policy. So when we are policymakers, we're negotiators, but of course the role of science, trade experts, customs experts being super important, how we can have the best available data at the right moment for policymaking. And there, I might say, OECD with the reports and plethora of information that we have had, it has been very important for a dialogue. And I think Daniel mentioned already in terms of transparency and data. And I will end up by saying trading waste being one of the challenges that developing countries have been trying to address. That's one of the areas that, for example, the dialogue is addressing through effective measures, for example, in terms of restricting unnecessary, harmful, and problematic plastics, including packaging. So how trade policy through the reduction of this, the reduction of production and the trade of these goods, but also when we talk to about activities, and then I will add services in the trade language, how trade policies to play an important role. So I will stop there. There are many other things that I would like to talk about, but of course, given the time, and happy to have another conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Danielle. I think you highlighted some of the really big issues, and I think important of the diversity of perspectives across countries on this, and of data to underpin those discussions. Carolyn, how are you going? Are you ready to be called on now?
I hope so. Here we go. Let me try again. Voila. Share. Excellent. Super. My apologies for that mistake before. So yeah, thank you again for having us today, and great to follow both Daniel and Daniela, who I work with a lot and have enormous respect for their work on this topic. So there are 3 core messages that I wanted to try and bring today. The first is that to end plastic pollution, we will need to cooperate internationally to control, harness, and also to transform trade. At present, we lack global rules, including on trade, to help shape the kind of production and consumption systems that we need to see, the systems change that we need to see across the plastics life cycle to end plastic pollution. So rules that address cross-border trade and value chains will be vital to transforming the plastics economy. And an ambitious global treaty is a place, provides an opportunity and a place to define such rules, including on trade, and to foster collaboration with the range of other relevant organizations, indeed organizations that have a key role to play in this space, like the WTO. So let me just share a few key slides to highlight some specific points on this message, on this. So the first, as Daniel had said with a slightly different diagram, is that trade is relevant across the plastics life cycle. And this one comes from UNEP, but it shows that at each point along the way, between different inputs, and as they become transformed and move through value chains, there is trade. And this is just a key point that I think we just cannot underestimate when we're thinking about how we work globally and cooperate globally to transform the production and consumption of plastics and move away in some instances from certain plastic products altogether. So trade flows across the life cycle are enormous, as Daniel mentioned, worth over 1.2 trillion per year. In this image, what we've tried to do is to highlight how the volume and value of trade varies across the life cycle. So as Daniel said, there's an enormous quantity of trade upstream. And as a share of production, it's worth noting that trade in primary plastics accounts for over 60% of global production. And here we've also noted the value of trade in feedstocks and precursors and also chemicals commonly used in plastic. This doesn't mean they're shaded in red, because this doesn't mean that all of those are directly going into plastics per se, but it just shows that they're part of that trade in those is part of that, that life cycle. And for those who are interested, I'll put in the chat afterwards a paper that we published today that looks very carefully at each of these stages of the life cycle, at the data on who are the top 20 exporters and importers at each phase across the life cycle. And what that paper does is highlight that it really is a global plastics economy. At each phase of the life cycle, we've got a range of different players. Some dominate across, but there are also a diversity of different actors involved from developing and developing countries along the life cycle. And of course, all countries are involved as importers. And when looking at this, in these trade flows on plastics, it's really important that we understand the limitations of the data, which is something that Daniel already alluded to. But not only do the data that I've provided not account for key elements such as the share of plastics embedded in non-plastic products, it also doesn't capture the plastic packaging integral to packaged products or the packaging used for transportation and distribution. So the value of trade, value and volume, is a lot higher than international trade statistics would have us understand. And the way in which we classify products in order to collect trade certificates through the HS system is also not well tailored to the kind of information that a lot of environmental policies need. So, for example, information on flows and production of primary plastics by polymer and feedstock, or a much more granular view of chemical additives. They also need a more granular view of the types of single-use plastics of high environmental concern that cross their borders. On the right here, you'll see the 6-digit classifications that we have from the HS system, and a lot of them remain at a very high level of aggregation. And we also don't get information from the HS system on the material composition of many, many products that contain plastics, or the material composition of waste. So there's a lot of work to be done when we think about regulating trade or finding ways to incentivize different types of trade. We will need a lot better tools for understanding what's flowing over borders. Reforms to the HS are part of that, but we'll also have to look at a range of other technical and technological ways of trying to understand what's in plastics as they cross borders. So I just have two more slides. This one just highlights the fact that ending plastic pollution will require trade-related interventions across the life cycle, as in the first image that I put up. But we'll need a systems change approach. So we have work going on in the context of the Basel Convention on trade in plastic waste. But there will need to be trade-related interventions to achieve a number of other aspects of the systems change approach, including reduction of supply of plastic polymers overall, elimination of certain products, a restriction of those. Trade measures can play a role in supporting improved design and substituting plastic products to promote reuse and reuse systems, and repair and recycling, and safe waste management. So on the far right there, I've highlighted a range of different trade-related measures that can be used to achieve some of those system change goals. So in terms of pathways, we know that we have the Global Plastics Treaty negotiation, which has some opportunities to promote trade-related cooperation within it. We have the Basel and Stockholm Conventions that have been mentioned in earlier panels today, but there are also a range of international organizations and processes that are relevant. So the WTO dialogue on plastics pollution has already played a key role, as Daniel has meant, in identifying what governments are already doing. They're doing a lot already with trade-related policies and measures in this space, and also what more they could do and where they could better collaborate. We also have the WCO and UNCTAD playing an active role in looking at issues of transparency and reporting and substitutes. The ISO, for example, will have a role to play on standards and so on. So what we will need ultimately is a range of different actors active on this space. And then just to end, in terms of some of the potential trade-related elements that might be pursued in the Plastics Treaty, here I've drawn inspiration from some of the submissions that governments have made to the INC process on potential elements in the treaty. And here I just quickly outlined that we have proposals for binding obligations to control not just the production, but also the trade in primary plastic polymers to reduce that to sustainable levels. There's also proposals to restrict production and trade in, or eliminate and restrict production and trade in unnecessary, avoidable, and problematic plastics that are harmful to health and the environment. And in that spirit, to also restrict trade with non-parties to the treaty as well. There's proposals to promote better regulation of plastic products that are placed on the market, such as through regulatory cooperation, standards and criteria. They can also help promote circularity, which I've got in the next point. And then finally, there's a number of recommendations that governments have made for provisions that will promote transparency, not only in production, but also in trade, not only of the quantities of plastics, materials, chemicals, and products that cross borders, but also in their material composition, and to look at ways that we can better trace and label products across value chains. So I'll stop there, and I hope that's a useful contribution, Julia.
Thanks very much, Karen. And I think that we've got a really good picture now of the complexity all along the value chain of where trade intersects. I'm going to drill down, though, next on an issue that was raised by Daniela as well, and that has been a focus of a lot of attention, which is the end-of-life plastics and the trade in waste. And what does it mean to try to encourage circularity, and how can trade do that? Do we use import bans in order to prevent leakage and decrease the incentives to produce more and more new plastic? Or do we then cause problems in terms of getting the economies of scale that we're relying on for circularity? So on that, I'm going to turn to Rob and ask, what can we learn from the general work that we've done on the circular economy for plastics?
Thanks, Julia. And I'm very happy. I'm from the OECD, so I can be short. I'm not going to summarize the work that we've done, because we have reports in the back of the room and you can pick those up, and I'll stay around afterwards if you want to follow up on that. I think we can spend our time better. So I have just a few quick remarks. First and foremost, trade cooperation can help to align upstream and downstream policies, but also to align across countries' policies. Focusing on better end-of-life management, improving plastics design, eliminating problematic substances. We've heard a lot of this already today, and I think that's good news. I think we're mainstreaming basically the messages across the OECD, but also in other organizations, and we're pretty well aligned. I think everybody's pretty well aligned on what needs to be done. And we do have solutions. We just need to implement them and find a way to implement them in the right way. So we do need to work together. One of the most important things, I think, is scaling up markets for secondary products and boosting circular economy business models. And for that, we definitely need trade. We cannot rely on every individual country harnessing its own waste streams and then trying to tease out all the materials that could potentially still have value. We do need to scale up those markets, and therefore we need trade. This requires better metrics on the composition of what we now very loosely call waste, but it's actually often not waste at all. We need better identification and classification of the value retained at end-of-life products. Ideally, we need harmonized standards. I know that's a tough topic. I'll not get into that. We need some things like novel solutions, like digitalization, to improve transparency, to improve traceability. Countries can think of single windows as an instrument to facilitate exporters, to basically facilitate the trade in those things that we want. So trade in secondary goods, trade in end-of-life products that have value. At the same time, we also need to control and harness, I think Caroline just called it, plastic trade that potentially could lead to environmental dumping. So we need to really tease out this difference between those trade streams that we want and those trade streams that we do not want. We should combat illegal waste trade very actively. Transboundary movement of hazardous waste, of course, is a topic that's been with us for quite a while, but it still requires a lot of attention. The BRS, the previous section, for example, alluded to that as well. To pick out one specific topic, biodegradable plastics. Personally, I'm always quite worried that if plastics are called biodegradable because they are biodegradable in a laboratory setting, if consumers see that, they see a label on it that's biodegradable, are they just going to throw it on the street because they think, well, it will just evaporate in a year or so, or less? So we do need to worry about how do we manage biodegradable plastics in a way that they do not leak long-term in the environment. There is a risk there, and I think we need to tackle that. And then my final point, I think it's vital that policy alignment doesn't get delayed until the stage where we're implementing instruments. So negotiators have to think now about whether the instruments that they're designing are fit for purpose, also from a trade angle. They need to exploit the synergies with trade policies, avoid the bottlenecks. So therefore, my call is to the trade negotiator, to the plastics negotiators, is talk to your trade policy colleagues. Their jargon may be scary, their discussions highly technical. They love acronyms. And I'm not saying that negotiators don't do that. And I think actually negotiators are probably better placed to talk to trade policymakers than domestic environmental policymakers. You're closer to it. So you have a head start in that sense. But we do see that in many countries, there are still silos in terms of how do we prepare policies. Even at OECD, we have different directorates and we talk to each other a lot, but still being in different directorates does mean that to some extent, we do our things separately. So it's worth to break down the silos within ministries, across ministries, make sure that this legally binding instrument that you're aiming for delivers on all fronts. Doing more for less requires a coordinated response that involves trade policy as much as possible. Thank you.
Thank you, Rob. And yes, it is true, trade people don't get invited to parties very often. Rob just gave, I think, and we've heard from all our speakers so far, like some really good ideas and a really good set of possibilities for managing this problem. But we've also heard about the fact this is a global problem and it has to work for all countries, and countries have different perspectives. So I'm going to turn to Smyajit Kaur from the WEF. And I'm going to ask him about the challenges for businesses and governments in developing countries, both in plastics management, but also as we've been talking about this issue of circularity, are there particular opportunities? This is an area where developing countries have really been very prominent.
Thank you, Julia. And I promise I'll be brief because the other speakers, Daniela, Rob, Caroline, and Danielle, they have teed the theory up really nicely for me so I can boost right into the practice. At the World Economic Forum, we ran 2 pilots in sub-Saharan African countries, in Ghana and South Africa, but also a lot of consultations in Latin America and in Southeast Asia, often bringing together the ministries of trade and environment in thinking of solutions that can, trade solutions that can help plastic action. And there are certain challenges that have come up which have not been talked about a lot in other circles. For the sake of brevity, I am going to kind of try to put these in 4 buckets. The first one is EPR. And we heard a lot about EPR in the first panel that we had today from the Honorable Delegate from Ghana, from TCI. This is, of course, a very popular, potent policy. And for people who are not fans of acronyms, I'm, of course, talking about extended producer responsibility. And while on the one hand, it's a potent policy, it has a lot of teething issues. some of the ones that we identified with our communities in these countries were the credibility of producer responsibility organizations, the ones that administer the fund, that needs to be established. Because if that credibility is not there, then the private sector will not always trust the policy, and that leads to compliance issues and free ridership based on definitions. So before having a well-functioning, biting EPR in place, we need to make sure that we have watertight definitions. And this also includes placing importers under the purview. Because there are some countries which have done amazing work on EPR legislation, but they have struggled a bit with where to put importers in the ambit of the definition. The second one, and I think both Daniela and Caroline talked about, it's on customs capacity. We have heard a lot of discussions on at the border management of plastic, not just plastic waste, but plastic products in general. There are really good talks of innovations in HS codes, granularity based on understanding recyclability or reusability. But all of this is predicated on how well equipped your customs are. And some of the developing country members that we have worked with have expressed some problems on this front. The third challenge is on the lack of services. Waste management services, recycling, or even labeling and certification, which are central to a circular economy of plastics, are not always the most readily available in many of the countries that we have worked in. And the final one, it's on the availability of finance. And I'm not going to go deeper into this because it was very well covered in the first panel. But related to this is the market size for awarding innovation. When you have small developing countries, the size of the market is not always big enough to incentivize innovation or innovative products more on the substitutes and alternative side. So these are the four challenges to your question, Madam Chair. But I'm not going to be all doom and gloom because already we have a cyclone waiting for us outside. So I'm going to come to the opportunities part because I think that's more interesting. I think Rob already kind of ventured into that territory. The biggest fundamental opportunity that we discovered in working with, I think, some of the countries in sub-Saharan Africa is this opens doors for trade and environment people to work together. This has not been the case for many years, even after the Paris Agreement. The two sides of the house do not come to each other's parties as much as they should. So this, with the WTO processes and the dialogue on plastic pollution, this is already starting to change. And to a great extent, the UNEA process is also making it much easier. The second one is on FDI facilitation. And this solves the problems of both lack of finance and lack of relevant services. So investment promotion agencies, or IPAs, another acronym, what they can do is they can work categorically in implementing certain facilitation measures that will then attract certain kinds of investments in services, which will then bolster the circular economy for plastics. One particular investment measure or facilitation measure that we talked about a lot was de-risking, because when you work in smaller markets where you do not have a very high visibility on the risk that you're taking, if the government or another party can come in and provide the de-risking service, that really helps in launching. The third one is, the third opportunity that we identified is using regional economic blocks and trade agreements to expand market access. There are a lot of substitutes for plastics, and I think, Daniel, you showed us a really nice slide on how many options we have at our behest, but many of these suffer from not having enough market access. But looking at trade agreements and regional economic blocks, we might work together on harmonizing standards, which will then open up these markets to a broader set of consumers, and then make this bigger. To give an example, I know harmonizing standards is a difficult topic, like Rob also mentioned, but in a very encouraging example, we were working with the South Africa Bureau of Standards in last year, and they launched a dedicated work stream on creating standards for circular plastics. And what is really wonderful is that once they are done with this work, this is actually going to feed into the African region, the Continental Standards Organization, which will then help feed into the AFCFTA processes and make a whole continental standard. So for example, if you had a substitute that could only be deployed in one country, now with continental standards, you have a much bigger market for that. And the last opportunity that we identified was on development cooperation and aid for trade. There are a lot of opportunities for developing countries to avail these mechanisms that are already in place. But going ahead, and thanks also to the WTO's Aid for Trade survey, it's also going to come out. There are a lot of opportunities for countries to engage in specific capacity development that bolsters customs capacities, but also maybe partnerships on standards, partnerships on certifications, which together contribute to a bigger size of the circular economy.
Thank you very much. That was very concrete and helpful. I particularly appreciate your putting the issue of standards on the table. That's an important one, because the good news is that everybody's doing something, but that's also a challenge when everybody's doing something slightly different. How do we make that work in an integrated global economy? I'm going to give the floor in a minute to, we have the high-level champion for COP25 from Chile here to make a few remarks, but a heads up to my panelists that I'm going to ask you at the end of that a lightning round. You have 30 seconds to respond, max. You're in an elevator, you were going to be on the 5th floor, you're on the 3rd floor, and you're going to the ground floor, and you're in the elevator with all the INC negotiators. What's your message to them? But first, please, can I turn to the high-level champion?
Here, right. Thanks so much, Julia, and thanks for inviting me to speak today. I'm here mostly with 3 hats. On one side, I'm, of course, as you said, part of the Chilean delegation that is led by Gonzalo Guayaquil here, so I'm part of his team, but I'm also an entrepreneur working in circular economy for 20 years in Latin America, running circular economy businesses with waste pickers, or green force, as we call them now, in 16 countries in the region. And I'm also, as you said, the high-level champion for COP25, having run and led the climate action agenda, mobilizing all stakeholders towards, in that case, the fulfillment of the Paris Agreement. Chile, as you probably know, is a very open economy that has got a great progress, thanks to having joined the OECD, has a great progress on circular economy. And now we are implementing the extended producer responsibility legislation, first on tires, then of course batteries, and now we're starting on packaging. What I would like to highlight there is that sometimes the forest in this case is not allowing us to see the trees. If you check the previous panel, most of the time they were not referring to plastics, they were referring to polymers and chemicals. And that creates a huge difference, Chairwoman. We think that it's important to understand that every polymer, every chemical has a difference in terms of not only its characteristic physiochemically, but also their economics. In that sense, what happens, and I think that definitely Daniel and Caroline showed very properly some of the difficulties that we're confronting. A country like Chile is importing a lot of waste. That's part of the reality. And I think that the previous panel expressed that very concretely. Putting the right type of regulation on trading is absolutely critical for the success of a global treaty on plastics. And therefore, it's a fundamental way to close the tap, as well as understanding that, for example, when it comes to just one particular polymer, PET, we have, as I said, a great workforce when it comes to the green force, collecting that material, instead of sometimes potentially collecting other types of polymers that have negative residual value. When it comes to PET, it has a positive economic value. But then most of that material is flowing as an export for the textile industry abroad, generating also an internal tension when it comes to potentially needing to serve the levels of recycled content in other PET products inside the country. So analyzing, again, material by material is absolutely critical in that sense. Lastly, what I want to mention here as, again, the high-level champion for COP25 is I encourage all member states to commit on an action agenda for this treaty as a way not only to mobilize the implementation of such a treaty, but also as a mechanism to understand and clarify most of these potential tensions around every type of polymer, every type of application, every industry, every region. And finally, if I have to say, in relation to what Rob mentioned on biodegradable plastics, for me, the best way to mobilize that solution is through a proper organic waste regulation. Even the methane agenda can help a lot on accelerating the implementation of real not only biodegradable plastic, but plastics that are degraded in the proper way. So there's a potential virtuosity around connection organics into polymers agenda. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Okay, so literally 10 to 30 seconds max each. Daniela, followed by Rob, followed by Jeet, and then Caroline. Off you go.
So I would say, I mean, we all, I mean, the whole system needs to be working together with ambition, responsibility and integrity, environment, trade, health, customs, standardization experts, and so on. 3 issues are of huge importance: reduction of production of primary plastic, subsidy policies in there as trade-related policies, remediating existing plastic pollution, best available technologies that doesn't harm biodiversity can be available through trade. And third, be careful with unintended consequences. I will stop.
All right, very briefly then from my side. The challenge is huge and there will be costs involved with managing plastics properly. So we cannot afford to implement bad policies. That means we need policy alignment. Policy alignment means policy coordination, and that means communication. Talk to each other.
I'll take the last low-hanging fruit. For INC2, definitely focus on definitions so that from the next INCs we can go more concrete. And talking about unintended consequences and communication, think about businesses in developing countries, especially SMEs, because they tend to be affected whatever becomes the outcome of the treaty.
Carolyn?
Yes, thanks. So for INC2, if I were in the lift, I would say that an ambitious treaty that ends plastic pollution, protects the environment and human health will need to have binding obligations to reduce the production and trade, the overall production and trade of primary plastic polymers. It will need to eliminate or restrict the production of trade in harmful, avoidable, problematic and unnecessary plastics and chemicals, and it will need to ensure global rules, standards, and criteria that can drive the investment needed in sustainable production and consumption across value chains and in developing the new economic opportunities that all countries will need to see in order to take up this transition.
Great, thanks very much. As you can see, this is a cheap way of not having to sum up as a chair, other than to say that thank you for your attention. My summary is clearly there's more we need to know, including lots of data, knowledge across HS. There's more we need to do, and you heard many good ideas for that, but we also need to talk and listen more. And with that, I'll hand over to Joe.
Julia, you brought that to an extremely succinct close, and I really congratulate the panelists and yourself for sticking to the elevator pitch in coming to an end. So look, thank you everyone, colleagues, delegates, everyone who's here in the room and online. You've been extremely patient for the afternoon. It's been a very rich discussion. So I just want to say that I hope the event, we picked 3 topics we hope would provide quite valuable insights for the upcoming INC negotiations. The things I just want to very quickly pick up on to bring this to a close are, first of all, to come back right to the beginning where Kerry-Ann Jones, Deputy Secretary General, talked about the triple planetary crisis. And I think we've heard today that that means that whether we're talking about climate change, biodiversity, pollution, and in this case, plastics, in all of the ways we've been talking about it, we need to tackle these things together and in a coordinated manner. Everything has got to be integrated. The key messages I kept hearing this afternoon were, first of all, turning off the tap. Second of all, the need for systems change in each of the sessions we've been talking, that has been a theme that has come through. We need to shift upstream from waste management to look at the whole life cycle, the value chain of plastics, and we need to take an integrated, coordinated response. With another recurring theme, the critical need for transparency on all aspects that we are talking about. On financing, I think it's abundantly clear in this area, as well as many others, that ODA is not going to be sufficient. Gap is going to have to be filled with a combination of domestic public funding, financial institutions, as well as the involvement of the private sector. And I took a really key point from the first session, the need to avoid fragmentation, given that there are a whole bunch of quite related things looking for financing to support different aspects of environmental challenges and issues. We really have to do this in a way that leverages the money that is there in an efficient way. And take a relook. So we're not seeking to find financing solutions on the basis of the current plastics economy. That gets back to that systems change. And then this last session, I think, has been really important for bringing into the discussion the relevance of trade across the plastics life cycle. And again, the need for a systems change approach. Talking about promoting trade that supports plastic circularity and recycling, and also limiting, restricting the cross-border movement of hazardous and problematic substances. So heaps there. And as everybody has said, there are an enormous and complex level of challenges that are going to have to be dealt with. But on the positive side, we've also heard a lot today about some opportunities and potential solutions. So that is good. And certainly in terms of trying to provide coordinated policy guidance, the OECD, as always, remains ready to support governments in navigating the challenges through its work. And I know that the suite of work we've done on plastics, including that flagship Global Plastics Outlook, 2 volumes of it, report published last year, has already helped inform the negotiations when we've got ongoing work across the field and environment, development, trade, chemicals, hopefully going to produce targeted data and evidence-based analysis to guide policy recommendations. My last duty and welcome duty is, of course, to thank you all, whether you're online or here in person, for your participation in this event. And I do want to extend really special thanks to our speakers, our panelists, moderators, as well as to our partners who helped us in the setup of the event. And I know several people had trouble with trying to get either into or across Paris to get here. So thank you for the efforts in doing so and making it. So the partners I wanted to identify and particularly thank are the Circulate Initiative, the World Bank, the UNEP family, the International Pollutants Elimination Network, the WTO, Forum on Trade, Environment and the SDGs, and the World Economic Forum. Also want to take a moment to really recognise our colleagues from the OECD Secretariat who put a great deal of work into organising this meeting. Colleagues from the Environment and Economy Integration Division and the Environment, Health and Safety Division of the Environment Directorate. Gosh, that's a mouthful. And we also greatly appreciate the involvement and assistance of our colleagues from the Development Cooperation Directorate, and of course, from the Trade and Agriculture Directorate for lending us their support. So again, thank you all very much for making this event a success. We really hope it is going to be a good kind of introduction and context setting for the upcoming work, and especially those of you who are going to be attending INC2. Thank you again very much indeed for being here. Seconds to